You know, it's a bit wild to think about, but right now, as you're probably snuggling under your covers, there are places in the world where ancient stones whisper tales of empires so vast they once spanned 3 continents, holding sway over a tapestry of cultures and peoples for centuries. Imagine a single power stretching from the gates of Vienna all the way to the scorching deserts of Yemen, encompassing the vibrant markets of Cairo, the holy sites of Jerusalem, and the bustling ports of Istanbul. We're talking about a phenomenon so enduring, so influential, that its echoes still resonate in our politics, our architecture, and even the way we drink coffee. This isn't just dusty old history. It's the very bedrock of the modern Middle East, parts of Europe, and North Africa. It's a story filled with epic sieges, dazzling scientific advancements, and enough palace intrigue to make your favorite fantasy series look a bit tame. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And so, our tale begins not with a bang, but with a whisper, a subtle stirring in the late 13th century in the dusty, fractured landscape of Anatolia, which today we call Turkey. At this point, the once mighty Byzantine Empire, a direct descendant of ancient Rome, was a shadow of its former self. Its once resplendent capital, Constantinople, now a beleaguered outpost clinging to survival amidst a sea of new, more vigorous powers. Across Anatolia, a patchwork of Turkic principalities, known as beyliks, had sprung up, each vying for influence in the aftermath of the Seljuk Sultanate, of Rome's decline, and the disruptive Mongol invasions that had reshaped the geopolitical map like a giant angry child knocking over building blocks. It was into this chaotic yet fertile ground that a relatively minor chieftain named Osman Shah, from whom the very name Ottoman is derived, began to carve out a small domain, a tiny acorn that would eventually grow into a colossal oak. He was not, it's safe to say, the most powerful of the beys by any stretch. His little realm was tucked away in the northwest of Anatolia, near the Byzantine frontier, a strategically perilous but also opportunistically rich location. This frontier, known as the Ghazi frontier, was a volatile melting pot where religious zeal and the promise of plunder fueled a constant skirmish. Ghazi warriors, often driven by a fervent desire to expand the Islamic world, or simply to get rich, constantly raided Byzantine lands, and Osman, being on this very edge, quickly attracted a following of these eager, restless souls. He was a pragmatic leader, not just a religious zealot, understanding that alliances, even with non-Muslims when necessary, were just as vital as the sword. Legends, as they often do, obscure the exact details of his early rise. But what's clear is that Osman possessed a knack for attracting loyal followers, consolidating small gains, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, expanding his sphere of influence. He wasn't conquering vast swathes of land in single dramatic battles. Instead, it was a steady, almost organic growth, like a slow-burning ember gradually igniting the surrounding kindling. This was a period when local Byzantine lords, often isolated and poorly supported by Constantinople, would sometimes even ally with Turkic beys against rival Byzantine factions, a situation Osman was no doubt keen to exploit. He built his initial power base around the town of Suud, a seemingly unremarkable place that would become the cradle of an empire. Historians still argue whether Osman's early successes were primarily due to his charismatic leadership, the inherent weakness of the Byzantines, or the sheer number of Ghazis drawn to his banner. But it was likely a potent cocktail of all three. He focused on absorbing surrounding Turkic tribes and capturing vulnerable Byzantine towns and castles, gradually extending his control over key trade routes and fertile agricultural lands. These early acquisitions, though small, provided the vital resources and manpower necessary to fuel further expansion. Unlike some of his more aggressive Bey neighbors, who often clashed amongst themselves, Osman seems to have possessed a shrewd, long-term vision, patiently building his strength rather than engaging in suicidal, glory-seeking battles. It was less about lightning strikes and more about persistent strategic encroachment, like water slowly eroding rock. His followers, seeing his measured success, became increasingly devoted, forming the very core of what would become the Ottoman military and administrative structure. The Byzantine Empire, meanwhile, was too distracted by its own internal squabbles and external threats from the West to fully grasp the growing danger on its eastern flank. They saw Osman's Beylik as just another nuisance, one of many, perhaps even a potential ally against other Turkic groups, failing to recognize the unique resilience and ambition brewing within this particular frontier state. This underestimation was a costly mistake, for while the Byzantines focused on their naval battles with Venice or Genoa, or dealing with Bulgar incursions, Osman's fledgling state was quietly, steadily gaining strength and cohesion right under their noses. Think of it like a tiny, unassuming spark in a dry forest that no one quite notices, until the whole thing is ablaze. The Ottoman administrative structure, even in its earliest, rudimentary form, allowed for the swift integration of conquered peoples and lands, a flexibility that many older empires lacked. Rather than simply imposing their will, they often incorporated existing systems, albeit with an Ottoman overlay, which made transitions smoother and reduced resistance. This adaptability, even in these nascent stages, set them apart and became a hallmark of their later imperial success, allowing them to absorb new territories and cultures with surprising ease. Osman's legacy, therefore, isn't just about military victories. It's about laying the social and political groundwork for a resilient, adaptable state. He fostered a system where loyalty to the ruling house was paramount and where opportunities for advancement were open, at least initially, to those with talent and bravery, regardless of their background. This meritocratic lean, however limited in its early application, was a powerful draw for ambitious individuals from across the fragmented Anatolian landscape. By the time of his death, likely around 1323 or 1324, Osman had transformed a small tribal entity into a nascent state, poised on the brink of significant expansion, having established a solid foundation of territory, a loyal following, and a clear, albeit unstated, trajectory towards future greatness. He may not have lived to see the grand empire, but he certainly planted the seed, watered it, and built the first little fence around it, setting the stage for his successors to truly expand the family business. Building upon the foundation laid by Osman, his son, Orhan Ghazi, stepped into the shoes of leadership. And if Osman was the shrewd planter of the seed, Orhan was the diligent gardener who made sure it blossomed into something far more substantial. While Osman had patiently accumulated scattered pieces of land, Orhan focused on consolidating these gains, and more importantly, capturing key strategic urban centers from the faltering Byzantines. It was under Orhan that the fledgling Ottoman state truly began to project itself as a regional power, moving beyond mere frontier raiding to organized conquest and administration. His reign, lasting from around 1324 to 1362, saw a significant acceleration in territorial expansion and, critically, the development of the nascent Ottoman state's administrative and military machinery. He wasn't just a warrior, he was a state builder, understanding that simply taking land wasn't enough. You also had to govern it. The capture of Bursa in 1326 was a watershed moment, marking a significant milestone in the Ottoman rise. This wasn't some minor village. Bursa was a prosperous Byzantine city, strategically located at the foot of Mount Uludağ, controlling vital trade routes and offering a rich prize. Its fall, after a long and arduous siege, provided the Ottomans with their first major capital city, a true urban center from which to administer their growing territories. Imagine finally moving out of a small, cramped apartment into a proper, spacious house. That's what Bursa represented. It offered not only administrative infrastructure, but also a thriving economy, allowing the Ottomans to levy taxes, establish markets, and attract skilled artisans and scholars. This transition from a nomadic, warrior-centric beylik to a settled, urban-based state was crucial. It meant a shift towards more sophisticated governance. The establishment of madrasas, religious schools, mosques, and public works, laying the groundwork for a more permanent and centralized authority. The city quickly transformed into an Ottoman jewel, showcasing their growing prosperity and ambition. Following Bursa's capture, Orhan set his sights on another crucial Byzantine stronghold, Nicaea. This city, modern-day Iznik, held immense symbolic and strategic importance. It had served as the temporary capital of the Byzantine Empire during the Latin occupation of Constantinople in the early 13th century, and its robust defenses made it a formidable challenge. The Siege of Nicaea, beginning in 1331, was another testament to Ottoman persistence and Orhan's tactical acumen. Unlike swift cavalry raids, these sieges required sustained effort, logistical planning, and the development of siege warfare techniques. When Nicaea eventually fell, it further solidified Ottoman control over northwestern Anatolia, effectively cutting off Constantinople from its Anatolian hinterland. These conquests weren't just about gaining land. They were about dismantling the Byzantine infrastructure piece by piece, like slowly disassembling a complicated machine. Each city captured brought more resources, more manpower, and more prestige to the burgeoning Ottoman state. Orhan's reign wasn't solely defined by conquest. He also focused on internal organization. He is credited with establishing the first formal Ottoman military organization beyond tribal levies, creating a standing army that would evolve into the formidable force the empire later became known for. This included the initial formation of what would eventually become the Janissaries. Although, in their earliest form, they were not yet the highly disciplined slave soldier corps they later became. Instead, they were likely a mix of professional soldiers and renegades. But their existence signaled a move away from relying solely on Ghazi volunteers, offering a more reliable and centralized fighting force. Historians still argue whether the Devshirme system, the controversial levy of Christian boys for military service, truly began under Orhan, or a later sultan, but the seeds of a professional, non-tribal army were certainly sown during his time. Furthermore, Orhan initiated the construction of public buildings, including mosques, emirets, soup kitchens, and hammams, bathhouses, which not only served the practical needs of the populace, but also visually asserted Ottoman sovereignty and presence in the newly conquered territories. These structures often blended local architectural styles with emerging Ottoman aesthetics, creating a unique visual identity for the growing empire. He also introduced the first formal Ottoman coinage, bearing his name, a tangible symbol of statehood and economic autonomy. This was a clear statement. We are not just raiders. We are here to stay. And we have our own money, thank you very much. Perhaps one of Orhan's most significant, yet often overlooked moves was his strategic marriage to Theodora Cantacuzene, the daughter of the Byzantine Emperor John VI Cantacuzene. This alliance, forged in 1346, was a shrewd political maneuver, demonstrating Orhan's pragmatic approach to foreign policy. It provided the Ottomans with valuable insights into Byzantine internal affairs and, crucially, allowed them to intervene in Byzantine civil wars, often on the side of John VI. This intervention, while seemingly aiding one faction, strategically weakened the Byzantine Empire as a whole, creating further opportunities for Ottoman expansion and influence. It was like watching two siblings fight and then offering to help one, knowing full well it benefits you most of all. This period saw Ottoman troops regularly crossing into Europe, not just as raiders, but as allies, gaining invaluable experience and establishing bridgeheads in the Balkans. The initial Ottoman crossing into Europe was not a grand invasion, but rather a gradual infiltration, often at the invitation of warring Byzantine factions. In 1354, a severe earthquake struck Gallipoli, a strategically vital Byzantine fortress on the European side of the Dardanelles. The walls collapsed, and the Ottomans, quick to seize the opportunity, occupied the ruined city, turning it into their first permanent foothold in Europe. This event, seen by some as divine providence, gave them an unassailable base from which to launch future campaigns into the Balkans. It was like getting a free, perfectly located beachhead. From this point on, the Ottomans were no longer just an Anatolian power. They were a European one too, setting the stage for centuries of conflict and cultural exchange on the continent. Orhan's reign, therefore, transitioned the Ottomans from a relatively small beylik into a formidable regional power, one with a capital, a nascent standing army, and a clear expansionist trajectory that now pointed firmly towards the rich lands of the Balkans. He truly took his father's vision and gave it form, substance, and a geographical reach that Osman could only have dreamed of. With a solid foothold now established on both sides of the Dardanelles, the stage was set for the next colossal figure in Ottoman history, Murad II, to take the reins. Ascending to the throne in 1362, after his father Orhan's death, Murad, often called Hudavendigar, or the Sovereign, inherited a burgeoning state and transformed it into a genuine empire, pushing its boundaries deep into the Balkans. If Orhan was the gardener, Murad was the architect, drawing up grand plans and laying the heavy foundations for an immense edifice. His reign, spanning from 1360 to 1389, marked a pivotal shift in Ottoman strategy, moving from opportunistic expansion to a systematic conquest of southeastern Europe. He was a military innovator and a shrewd statesman, recognizing that controlling vast territories required more than just brute force. It required organized administration, effective communication, and strategic foresight. Murad's military campaigns were relentless and highly effective, targeting the fragmented and often feuding Balkan states. Unlike the unified resistance the Ottomans would later face, the kingdoms and principalities of Serbia, Bulgaria, and Bosnia were often at odds with each other, weakened by internal rivalries and religious divisions. This disunity played directly into Ottoman hands, allowing Murad to pick them off one by one, like a patient predator in a flock of bickering sheep. He understood the power of psychological warfare and the importance of decisive, overwhelming force. The first major target was Adrianople, a significant Byzantine city second only to Constantinople in importance. Its capture in 1362, or perhaps a year or two later, depending on which historian you consult. Because honestly, sometimes keeping track of medieval dates is like trying to nail jelly to a wall, was a monumental achievement. Renamed Edirne, it eventually replaced Bursa as the Ottoman capital, offering a far more strategic location for directing campaigns into Europe. This move signaled a clear intent. The Ottomans were here to stay in Europe, and they were not just raiding, they were settling. Murad also significantly formalized and expanded the Janissary Corps, transforming it into the formidable elite infantry unit it would become. This wasn't just about getting more soldiers. It was about creating a disciplined, loyal fighting force completely beholden to the Sultan. The Devshirme system, which involved levying Christian boys from conquered territories, converting them to Islam, and training them from a young age specifically for military or administrative service, was fully implemented under Murad. These boys, ripped from their families, were rigorously trained, educated, and instilled with an almost fanatical loyalty to the Sultan. They were forbidden from marrying or owning property in their early careers, ensuring their sole focus remained on service. This created a highly professional standing army, a stark contrast to the often unreliable feudal levies common in contemporary European armies. It was, of course, a harsh and controversial system, but undeniably effective, creating soldiers who knew no home but the barracks and no father but the Sultan, making them terrifyingly effective instruments of war. Murad's expansion into the Balkans continued with a series of decisive victories. He subjugated various Serbian lords, expanding Ottoman control over parts of Macedonia and Thrace. The Battle of Maritsa in 1371 was another crucial engagement, where Ottoman forces decisively defeated a large coalition of Serbian, Bulgarian, and Hungarian forces. This crushing defeat crippled much of the remaining Serbian aristocracy and opened the way for deeper Ottoman penetration into the Balkan Peninsula. It was a clear demonstration that the Ottomans were not just a regional threat, but a dominant force that could rout even combined European armies. These victories were not simply about taking land. They were about integrating the conquered territories into the Ottoman system. Murad implemented the Timar system, a form of land grant given in exchange for military service, which helped to administer the new territories and create a loyal cavalry force known as the Sipahis. This ingenious system allowed the Ottomans to govern vast areas without needing an enormous standing bureaucracy, relying instead on local lords who now owed their loyalty and military service to the Sultan. Beyond military prowess, Murad was also a significant patron of architecture and learning. He oversaw the construction of numerous mosques, bridges, and other public works in both Anatolia and the newly conquered European territories, helping to solidify Ottoman presence and legitimacy. These structures served as physical embodiments of Ottoman power and cultural influence, subtly yet firmly integrating the new lands into the imperial fabric. His focus on infrastructure also facilitated trade and communication, further strengthening the state. He was also a keen administrator, refining the legal and administrative codes that had begun to develop under his predecessors, ensuring a more centralized and efficient governance of his growing domains. It's during his reign that the foundations of the classical Ottoman state apparatus truly began to coalesce, moving beyond ad hoc arrangements to a more structured and coherent system. Murad's diplomatic efforts were equally important. He skillfully played various European powers against each other, often exploiting their rivalries to his advantage. He would sign truces, break them when opportune, and maintain a constant state of pressure on his European neighbors, never allowing them to fully recover or form a united front. He was, in essence, a master chess player, always thinking several moves ahead on the geopolitical board. While his military might was undeniable, his political cunning was equally instrumental in the rapid expansion of the empire. He wasn't just swinging a sword. He was also weaving a complex web of alliances and betrayals. The sheer extent of his conquests meant that by the end of his reign, the Ottoman Empire had transformed from a regional Anatolian power into a formidable transcontinental force, a dominant player on the European stage, whose shadow now loomed large over the remaining Christian states of the Balkans. He truly cemented the empire's European identity, ensuring that its future would be inextricably linked with the continent. The stage was now perfectly set for the culmination of Murad III's grand designs, a moment that would forever etch his name into the annals of history and send ripples of fear and awe across Europe. The Battle of Kosovo in 1389. This wasn't just another skirmish. It was a clash of titans, a defining moment that would solidify Ottoman dominance in the Balkans and tragically cost Murad his life. He wasn't just a conqueror. He was a leader who led from the front, even if that front proved to be his undoing. The battle itself was a massive undertaking, drawing together a formidable coalition of Balkan Christian forces, primarily Serbs led by Prince Lazar Rebeljanović, along with Bosnian, Bulgarian, Wallachian, and Albanian contingents, all united for once against the common Ottoman threat. They recognized that this was likely their last stand, their final chance to push back the tide. The plain of Kosovo, a vast open expanse, became the theater for this epic confrontation. Imagine the scene. Thousands upon thousands of warriors arrayed against each other, banners snapping in the wind, the air thick with tension, the clanking of armor, and the nervous murmur of men awaiting the signal to charge. On one side, the disciplined, well-organized Ottoman forces, bolstered by their elite janissaries and swift Sipahi cavalry, led by Murad Tamam and his sons, Bayezid and Yaqub. On the other, the desperate yet courageous Balkan coalition, fighting for their homes, their faith, and their very existence. This was a battle where the stakes couldn't have been higher. A true winner-takes-all scenario that would shape the future of southeastern Europe for centuries. The battle itself was a brutal, hard-fought affair, lasting for hours under the sweltering sun. Accounts vary wildly, as they often do with medieval battles, where official scorekeepers were a rare commodity, and propaganda was very much a thing. But one narrative remains consistently dramatic: the death of Sultan Murad II. According to Ottoman tradition, Murad was either assassinated on the battlefield after the main fighting had subsided, possibly by a Serb knight named Miloš Obilić, who feigned surrender, or he was struck down during the thick of the fighting. Serbian epic poetry, on the other hand, portrays Obilić as a heroic figure who bravely cut his way through Ottoman lines to reach and slay the Sultan. Regardless of the exact circumstances, the fact remains that Murad II, the architect of so much Ottoman expansion, perished on the field of his greatest victory. It's one of those historical moments where the sheer unexpectedness of the event adds to its legendary status, almost as if fate itself decided to add a dramatic twist to an already monumental day. Despite the loss of their sultan, the Ottoman forces, under the immediate command of Murad's son, Bayezid, who quickly asserted control and ruthlessly eliminated his brother Yaqub to prevent a succession struggle. Because, family rivalries in royal courts always seem to escalate quickly, managed to secure a decisive victory. Prince Lazar of Serbia was captured and executed, and the Christian coalition was utterly routed, their resistance shattered. The Battle of Kosovo marked the effective end of independent Serbian statehood for nearly 500 years, transforming Serbia into a vassal state of the Ottoman Empire. This wasn't just a military defeat, it was a political and cultural cataclysm for the Serbs, whose memory of the battle became deeply ingrained in their national identity. A blend of sorrow, heroism, and enduring hope for liberation. It's a bit like remembering that really bad group project in college where everyone worked hard, but it still ended up a disaster. Only, with significantly more bloodshed and geopolitical consequences. The immediate aftermath of Kosovo saw the Ottomans solidify their control over a significant portion of the Balkans. While some areas maintained a degree of autonomy as vassal states, they were required to pay tribute, provide military contingents to the Ottoman army, and acknowledge the Sultan's suzerainty. This system of vassalage was a clever way for the Ottomans to expand their influence without immediately incurring the full administrative burden of direct rule. It was a gradual absorption, allowing conquered populations to slowly acclimatize to Ottoman rule. The flow of tribute and soldiers from these vassal states further fueled the Ottoman war machine, creating a self-reinforcing cycle of expansion. The victory at Kosovo also had profound implications for the wider European continent. It sent a chill down the spines of Christian rulers, particularly in Hungary and Venice, who now faced a powerful, expanding Muslim empire directly on their borders. The Ottoman threat became a constant source of anxiety and a recurring theme in European diplomacy for centuries. Yet, despite the obvious danger, the internecine squabbles and political rivalries among European powers often prevented them from forming a truly unified and effective defensive front against the Ottomans. Historians still argue whether a truly united European crusade at this point could have stemmed the Ottoman tide, or if their internal divisions and the Ottomans' superior organization made such an outcome inevitable. It's one of those tantalizing what-if scenarios that keeps historians up at night, pondering alternative timelines where perhaps everyone just got along for 5 minutes. For the Ottomans, the victory cemented their reputation as an unstoppable force, a power with seemingly divine favor. Murat Tvams, though dead, became a martyr for the Ghazi cause, his legacy providing immense spiritual and moral impetus for further conquests. His death on the battlefield, rather than diminishing his stature, elevated him to an almost mythical status, inspiring subsequent generations of Ottoman sultans and soldiers. The Ottoman Empire was now not just a regional power. It was a transcontinental empire straddling Europe and Asia, and its trajectory was unmistakably upwards. The stage was now set for the next chapter, under the swift and often ruthless leadership of Bayezid I, the new sultan who had witnessed his father's death and cemented his own power in the crucible of Kosovo. With the dust of Kosovo still settling and the echoes of his father's tragic death fresh in his mind, Bayezid I ascended to the Ottoman throne. Known as Yildirim, the Thunderbolt, due to the incredible speed of his campaigns and his decisive, almost impulsive nature, Bayezid's reign, 1389 to 1402, marked a period of furious expansion and dramatic consolidation, pushing the empire's boundaries to their furthest extent before a cataclysmic encounter with a new, equally terrifying force. If Murad was the steady architect, Bayezid was the express train, roaring down the tracks, steam billowing, determined to reach his destination at breakneck speed, come what may. He was a man of immense energy and ambition, seemingly always on the move, always campaigning, and always looking for the next territory to add to his burgeoning empire. Bayezid's immediate priority was to consolidate Ottoman control over the Balkans, a task he pursued with characteristic vigor. He quickly forced the remaining independent Bulgarian principalities into submission, making Bulgaria a fully integrated Ottoman province. He then turned his attention to Wallachia and parts of Greece, pushing deeper into the Peloponnese. His strategy was often direct military conquest, followed by the imposition of a vassalage system or direct rule, depending on the strategic importance and resistance encountered. He wasn't one for lengthy diplomatic niceties. He preferred to let his army do the talking. The rapid pace of his campaigns instilled widespread fear among the remaining Christian states, leading some to voluntarily submit to Ottoman suzerainty, recognizing the futility of resistance against such a relentless foe. It was like watching a really fast, really big storm cloud heading your way. Sometimes, it's just smarter to batten down the hatches and hope for the best. His aggressive expansion in the Balkans naturally alarmed the rest of Christian Europe, particularly Hungary, which now found itself directly confronting the Ottoman juggernaut. This mounting concern culminated in the Crusade of Nicopolis in 1396, a massive, albeit ill-fated attempt by a pan-European army, primarily composed of French, Hungarian, and Wallachian forces, to push the Ottomans back. Led by King Sigismund of Hungary and John the Fearless of Burgundy, this crusade was seen as the definitive stand against the Ottoman threat, a chance to reclaim lost territories and restore Christian dominance in the Balkans. It was essentially Europe's grand Operation Regain Control. However, the Battle of Nicopolis proved to be a resounding disaster for the Crusaders. Bayezid, alerted to their advance, swiftly moved his forces, catching the overconfident and often undisciplined Crusader army unprepared. The French knights, eager for glory, charged prematurely without coordinating with the Hungarian main force, allowing the Ottomans to encircle and annihilate them. The defeat was crushing. Almost an entire generation of French nobility was wiped out, and the power of Hungary was severely weakened. Bayezid's victory at Nicopolis not only confirmed Ottoman military superiority, but also effectively removed the last significant organized European resistance to Ottoman expansion in the Balkans for decades. It solidified his nickname. The thunderbolt had truly struck. This victory allowed Bayezid to tighten his grip on the region even further, and to launch punitive raids into Hungary itself. With the Balkans largely subdued, Bayezid then turned his attention eastward, where he began to aggressively absorb other Turkic beyliks in Anatolia. This move was significant because up until this point, the Ottomans had largely focused on expanding at the expense of the Byzantines and Balkan Christians. Now, Bayezid was challenging fellow Turkic rulers, centralizing power, and laying claim to the legacy of the Seljuk Sultanate. This ambition, however, would prove to be his undoing, as it brought him into direct conflict with a force far more formidable than any he had yet encountered: Timur, also known as Tamerlane. Timur, a Turco-Mongol conqueror of immense military genius, was in the process of building his own vast empire, stretching from Central Asia across Persia and into India. His vision clashed directly with Bayezid's burgeoning Anatolian dominance. The two rulers, both supremely confident and utterly ruthless, engaged in a series of increasingly heated diplomatic exchanges filled with insults and challenges, like two alpha predators marking their territory. Bayezid, perhaps blinded by his rapid successes and inflated by his victory at Nicopolis, underestimated the sheer power and strategic brilliance of Timur. He had, after all, never truly faced a peer in military might. Historians still debate whether Bayezid's arrogant disregard for Timur was a fatal flaw, or if the clash was simply an inevitable collision between two expanding empires. But it certainly didn't help that he kept sending sassy letters. The confrontation culminated in the catastrophic Battle of Ankara in 1402. This was not just a battle. It was an imperial showdown, a clash of two very different but equally devastating military machines. Timur, employing his vast numerical superiority and masterful tactical genius, outmaneuvered and decisively defeated the Ottoman army. Crucially, many of the Turkic Sipahis, who had recently been incorporated into Bayezid's army from the beyliks Bayezid had conquered, defected to Timur's side during the battle, seeing him as a fellow Turkic ruler rather than their new Ottoman overlord. This mass defection was a crippling blow to Bayezid's forces and a testament to Timur's cunning in exploiting internal Ottoman divisions. The defeat was absolute and devastating. Bayezid I himself was captured, the only Ottoman sultan in history to suffer such a fate. He was paraded in a cage by Timur, a humiliating spectacle that symbolized the utter collapse of his power. The once feared thunderbolt was now a captive, his grand ambitions shattered. Bayezid died in captivity a few months later, broken and humiliated. The Battle of Ankara reversed decades of Ottoman expansion, leading to the re-establishment of the Anatolian beyliks that Bayezid had so painstakingly absorbed, and plunging the empire into a period of chaos known as the Ottoman Interregnum. It was as if someone had hit the reset button on the Ottoman Empire, and suddenly all the progress made by Osman Orhan and Murad, consolidated so furiously by Bayezid, seemed to unravel in a single terrible day. The empire was not destroyed, but it was certainly knocked back to square one, or perhaps even further back, facing an existential crisis. The catastrophic defeat at Ankara and the ignominious capture and death of Bayezid I plunged the Ottoman state into its darkest and most perilous period, a tumultuous era known as the Ottoman Interregnum. This wasn't just a hiccup in imperial expansion. It was a near-death experience, a brutal 11-year civil war, 1402-1413, where four of Bayezid's sons, Isa, Musa, Suleiman, and Mehmed, tore the empire apart in a desperate, often bloody, struggle for the sultanate. Imagine the most dysfunctional family reunion you can picture. Then add armies, assassinations, and entire provinces switching allegiances, and you're getting close to the chaotic reality of this period. The carefully constructed edifice of Ottoman power, so swiftly built by the preceding sultans, now seemed to crumble under the weight of internecine conflict. Timur, the conqueror who had dealt the devastating blow, had no intention of fully occupying Anatolia or extinguishing the Ottoman state entirely. His aim was to dismantle a rival power and reassert his own suzerainty over the region, perhaps even preferring a weakened, fractured Ottoman realm as a buffer. After his victory, he re-established the various Anatolian beyliks that Bayezid had previously conquered, effectively undoing decades of Ottoman centralization in Asia Minor. This strategic move ensured that the Ottoman heartland was fragmented, preventing any immediate resurgence. He then moved on to other conquests, leaving the shattered Ottoman state to its own devices, much like a cat batting a mouse around before getting bored and leaving it to writhe. The ensuing civil war was a brutal free-for-all. Each of Bayezid's sons, known as the Shehzades, established their own power bases and vied for control, forming shifting alliances with Byzantine emperors, European powers, and the re-emerging Anatolian beyliks. Suleiman, initially controlling the European territories and much of Western Anatolia, tried to leverage alliances with the Byzantines and Venice. Musa, after some initial setbacks, gained control of the European side, often adopting a more hardline anti-Christian stance, which led to conflicts with Suleiman. Isa struggled to maintain any consistent power base in Anatolia, often caught between his brothers. Meanwhile, Mehmed, the youngest, began his patient and ultimately successful rise in the more eastern parts of Anatolia, learning from his brother's mistakes and building a loyal following. It was like a very violent game of musical chairs, with the Ottoman throne as the prize, and the music kept stopping in the most inconvenient places. This period of internal strife created immense instability throughout the empire. Trade routes were disrupted, administration faltered, and regions previously brought under firm Ottoman control began to waver in their allegiance. In the Balkans, some vassal states seized the opportunity to assert greater independence, or even revert to full autonomy, albeit temporarily. The Byzantines, ever opportunistic, tried to play one Shehzad against another, hoping to regain some of their lost territories and influence. This wasn't just a political crisis. It was an economic and social one too, as the common people suffered from constant warfare, banditry, and the breakdown of central authority. The once feared Ottoman military, while still formidable in parts, lacked unified command and was often engaged in fratricidal conflict rather than external conquest. What's truly remarkable, and a testament to the underlying strength and resilience of the Ottoman state, is that it survived this profound crisis at all. Many other empires would have simply fragmented beyond repair. But beneath the dynastic squabbles, the institutional foundations laid by Osman, Orhan, and Murad, particularly the loyalty of the Janissaries and a core group of administrators, proved surprisingly robust. The Devshirme system, ironically, produced a class of loyal servants who were often more attached to the concept of the Ottoman state than to any particular Shehzad. The bureaucracy, though strained, did not completely collapse, and the Taima system, while disrupted, still provided a framework for local governance and military mobilization. Ultimately, it was Mehmed Çelebi, known later as Mehmed I, who emerged victorious from this brutal fraternal struggle. He was a shrewd and patient leader, demonstrating considerable political skill and military acumen. He first secured his position in Anatolia, building alliances and systematically eliminating his brothers. His most significant victory came in 1413 against his brother Musa, who had established a strong power base in Rumelia, the European part of the empire, and was proving to be a formidable opponent. Mehmed's victory over Musa, often with the support of Byzantine and Serbian allies, who preferred his more conciliatory approach to Musa's aggression, brought the long and destructive interregnum to an end. He had, quite literally, put the empire back together, piece by agonizing piece, gluing the shattered fragments with his own sweat and blood. The survival of the Ottoman Empire during the interregnum is a mainstream historical fact that underlines its inherent institutional strength, despite dynastic weaknesses. The ability of the state to endure such a severe test, to pull itself back from the brink of total dissolution, speaks volumes about the administrative structures and loyalties that had already been forged. It proved that the Ottoman enterprise was more than just the personal ambition of a single sultan. It had developed into a cohesive, albeit temporarily fractured entity with deep roots. When Mehmed I finally consolidated power, he inherited a deeply scarred but surprisingly resilient empire, ready for the painstaking process of reconstruction and re-expansion. The experience of the interregnum, however, undoubtedly left an indelible mark on the Ottoman psyche, underscoring the vital importance of a clear and undisputed succession to the throne, a lesson that would echo through future centuries of Ottoman rule. Emerging from the crucible of the interregnum, Mehmed I, often referred to as the restorer of the Ottoman Empire, faced the monumental task of stitching back together a realm torn apart by civil war and external pressures. His reign from 1413 to 1421 was less about dramatic new conquests and more about patient, methodical consolidation, rebuilding the shattered administrative framework and reasserting Ottoman authority over territories that had either broken away or become semi-independent during the chaos. If the previous period was a demolition derby, Mehmed's job was to operate the very large, very slow crane, carefully picking up the pieces and putting them back in place. He was not the thunderbolt, but rather the meticulous craftsman, quietly and steadily repairing the damage. The immediate aftermath of the interregnum saw a landscape of fragmentation. Many of the Anatolian beyliks that Bayezid I had forcefully absorbed had re-established their independence, and in the Balkans, some vassal states were testing the limits of their allegiance to the weakened Ottoman center. Mehmed understood that before any grand new campaigns could be contemplated, internal stability and centralized control had to be firmly re-established. This meant a delicate balance of diplomacy, coercion, and, when necessary, military force. He began by reasserting his authority over the Anatolian beyliks, patiently but firmly, bringing them back into the fold, often through a combination of military pressure and strategic alliances with those less willing to resist. He was keen to avoid another devastating war that would further exhaust his already strained resources. One of Mehmed's critical challenges was dealing with the persistent threat of rival claimants and internal rebellions. The embers of civil war still flickered, and ambitious figures, sometimes supported by external powers, tried to exploit any perceived weakness. Perhaps the most notable of these was the rebellion led by Sheikh Bedreddin, a charismatic scholar and mystic who preached a utopian vision of interreligious harmony and social equality. His movement, attracting a significant following among dispossessed peasants, dervishes, and even some Ottoman soldiers, posed a serious ideological and social threat to the newly restored order. This wasn't just a challenge to Mehmed's rule, it was a challenge to the very social fabric of the empire. Mehmed eventually had to suppress this rebellion with considerable force, highlighting the deep-seated societal unrest that the interregnum had unearthed. It's a reminder that even when things seem to be settling, there's always someone with a radical new idea ready to stir the pot. Usually at the most inconvenient time. In the Balkans, Mehmed adopted a more cautious approach compared to his predecessors. He largely focused on consolidating the gains made before Ankara, rather than embarking on ambitious new conquests. He re-established Ottoman suzerainty over most of the vassal states, often through shrewd diplomacy and treaties that offered them a degree of internal autonomy in exchange for tribute and military service. This pragmatic approach helped to stabilize the European frontier and prevented the formation of new, large-scale European coalitions against the Ottomans, giving the empire much-needed breathing room to recover. He understood that a gradual approach was better than overextending a still fragile state. The Byzantines, having played a role in supporting Mehmed against his brothers during the interregnum, now found themselves in a curious position. While Mehmed maintained a generally peaceful relationship with Constantinople, he also continued to exert pressure on them, slowly but surely, chipping away at their remaining territories around the capital. He was, in essence, tightening the noose. Albeit gently, this allowed him to consolidate Ottoman control over the approaches to Constantinople without provoking a major confrontation that he was not yet ready for. Historians still argue about whether Mehmed I could have attempted the conquest of Constantinople during his reign. Most agree that his focus on internal stability and avoiding another costly war took precedence. He was playing the long game, preparing the ground for future generations rather than rushing headlong into another grand siege. Mehmed also dedicated significant effort to rebuilding the state administration and economy. He reopened trade routes, encouraged agriculture, and initiated public works projects to restore confidence and prosperity. He recognized that a strong economy was essential for a stable empire. He worked to strengthen the Janissary Corps and refine the Timar system, ensuring that the military machine, though battered, was once again well-oiled and ready for future campaigns. His reign was characterized by a concerted effort to restore legal order and central authority, which had eroded dramatically during the years of civil war. He was effectively putting out fires and mending fences across a vast and fractured landscape. One notable foreign policy achievement was the signing of a peace treaty with Venice in 1416, which, after a period of naval skirmishes, helped to stabilize Ottoman maritime trade in the Aegean and provided a sense of legitimacy to the Ottoman presence in the region. This showed his diplomatic savvy and his understanding that not all conflicts needed to be resolved by the sword. It was also during Mehmed I's reign that the Ottoman court began to regain some of its lost prestige and splendor. He was a patron of arts and architecture, sponsoring the construction of mosques and bridges and encouraging scholarship. These initiatives were not just about aesthetics. They were about projecting an image of renewed strength, stability, and cultural flourishing after years of debilitating conflict. In essence, Mehmed I's reign was an indispensable chapter in the Ottoman story, demonstrating the empire's extraordinary capacity for resilience and self-renewal. He didn't capture legendary cities or lead epic crusades, but he performed the far less glamorous, yet equally crucial, work of rebuilding from the ground up. He ensured that when he passed away, he left a functioning, unified, and increasingly confident state to his successor, Murad II. The very fact that the Ottoman Empire not only survived the interregnum, but emerged from it stronger and more centralized, is a testament to the fundamental soundness of its early institutions and the pragmatic leadership of Mehmed IV. He took a broken kingdom and with steady hands put it back on the path to becoming a world-spanning power once more. Upon the death of Mehmed I in 1421, his son, Murad II, inherited an empire that, while patched up, still bore the scars of the interregnum and faced numerous challenges, both internal and external. Murad's reign from 1421 to 1444, and then again from 1446 to 1451, after a brief abdication, was a period of sustained effort to finally put the ghosts of the civil war to rest, to reassert Ottoman dominance in both Anatolia and the Balkans, and to lay the immediate groundwork for the empire's golden age. If Mehmed I was the careful restorer, Murad II was the patient rebuilder, adding strength and grandeur to the foundations, all while fending off constant threats from all sides. He possessed a shrewd combination of military prowess and diplomatic subtlety, understanding when to strike hard and when to make a tactical retreat. One of Murad's immediate challenges was, inevitably, dealing with rival claimants to the throne, often supported by external powers eager to destabilize the Ottoman state. The most significant of these was the rebellion of Mustafa Çelebi, an alleged brother of Mehmed I, who had gained support from the Byzantine emperor and some disgruntled Ottoman factions. This false Mustafa, as he was sometimes called, launched a serious challenge to Murad's rule, even managing to capture parts of Rumelia. Murad, however, demonstrated his military competence and political resolve by decisively defeating Mustafa, ending this lingering threat to dynastic unity. This crushing of the last major pretender helped to solidify the principle of singular rule and prevent a recurrence of the interregnum's chaos. It was a clear message to anyone thinking of challenging the Sultan. Don't. With internal stability largely secured, Murad turned his formidable attention to re-establishing Ottoman supremacy in the Balkans. He faced a particularly tenacious opponent in the Hungarian general John Hunyadi, a brilliant military tactician who consistently rallied Christian forces against the advancing Ottomans. The conflicts between Murad and Hunyadi were a relentless series of battles, sieges, and campaigns, a true test of strength and endurance for both sides. Murad laid siege to Thessalonica, a major Byzantine port city, eventually capturing it in 1430. This conquest was significant, providing the Ottomans with another major Mediterranean port and further extending their control over the Aegean. However, Murad also faced setbacks. Hunyadi's forces inflicted several defeats on the Ottomans, culminating in the Battle of Nis in 1443 and the subsequent Long Campaign, which saw Christian forces push deep into Ottoman territory in the Balkans. These defeats forced Murad to consider a temporary truce, demonstrating his pragmatic willingness to negotiate when circumstances demanded it. It was a strategic retreat, not a surrender, a moment to regroup and reevaluate. This led to the Peace of Szeged in 1444, a treaty that temporarily conceded some territories and recognized Hungarian influence in certain areas of the Balkans. Many in Europe saw this as a sign of Ottoman weakness, a rare moment where they seemed to be on the back foot. This period also saw one of the most intriguing episodes in Murad's life, his abdication in 1444. Exhausted by constant warfare, and perhaps hoping for a quieter life, Murad controversially handed the throne over to his young son, Mehmed II, who would later become the conqueror. This decision, unprecedented in Ottoman history, immediately backfired. The young Mehmed II was simply not ready to handle the immense pressures of the Sultanate, and sensing Ottoman vulnerability due to the youthful and inexperienced ruler, the European powers, instigated by papal calls for a new crusade, immediately broke the Peace of Szeged. This betrayal led to the Battle of Varna in 1444. A massive European crusader army, composed primarily of Polish and Hungarian forces under King Władysław III of Poland and John Hunyadi, marched into Ottoman territory. The situation became so dire that the Ottoman Grand Vizier famously begged the retired Murad to return to lead the army, reportedly saying, "If you are the Sultan, come and lead your armies. If I am the Sultan, I order you to come and lead my armies." Murad, reluctantly, returned to the battlefield, personally leading his forces to a decisive and utterly crushing victory at Varna. This battle annihilated the Crusader army, killed King Władysław, and firmly re-established Ottoman dominance in the Balkans, effectively ending any large-scale European attempts to dislodge them for decades to come. It was a spectacular comeback, demonstrating that you can't keep a good sultan down, especially when his empire is on the line. Murad then resumed his reign, focusing on further consolidating Ottoman power and building up the infrastructure for future expansion. He continued to refine the Janissary system, ensuring a steady supply of loyal, well-trained soldiers. He also invested heavily in public works, including bridges, mosques, and madrasas, further integrating the conquered territories and cementing Ottoman cultural presence. His court became a center of learning and arts, attracting scholars and artisans from across the Islamic world, contributing to a sense of renewed imperial grandeur. He was, after all, laying the intellectual and physical groundwork for the next major leap forward. Historians still debate whether Murad II's abdication was a genuine attempt to retire or a shrewd political maneuver to test his son and the stability of the state. Regardless, his return and victory at Varna cemented his reputation as a formidable leader who could overcome even the most daunting challenges. He faced a constant barrage of external threats and internal unrest, yet he managed not only to preserve the empire, but to significantly strengthen it, leaving a consolidated and robust state for his heir. He was the vital link between the period of recovery and the era of unprecedented expansion, proving that resilience and strategic foresight were just as important as the sword in the making of an empire. The stage was now perfectly set, the empire having recovered from its near-fatal collapse and consolidated its strength under Mehmed I and Murad II. It was into this robust, yet still ambitious state that Mehmed II, the young prince who had briefly and awkwardly held the throne before Varna, fully stepped as sultan in 1451, following his father Murad II's final passing. This wasn't just another succession. It was the dawn of an era that would redefine the Ottoman Empire and reshape the geopolitical map of the world. Mehmed II, later to be known as Fatih or the Conqueror, was a man of extraordinary intellect, ruthless determination, and an almost obsessive focus on one singular monumental objective: the fall of Constantinople. He had, after all, been humiliated by his earlier brief reign and was eager to prove his mettle. Constantinople, the venerable capital of the Byzantine Empire, had stood as a beacon of Roman and Christian civilization for over 1,000 years. Its strategic location, commanding the Bosporus Strait, and thus the gateway between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean, made it a prize beyond measure, a glittering jewel that had eluded every previous Ottoman attempt. For the Ottomans, it was more than just a city. It was a symbol. Its conquest would not only provide a new, more magnificent capital, but also symbolize the ultimate triumph of Islam over Byzantium, fulfilling ancient prophecies and cementing Ottoman legitimacy as the inheritors of Roman imperial glory. For Mehmed, it was a personal quest, a destiny he felt compelled to fulfill. He had been tutored extensively in various sciences, languages, and military strategies, preparing him for this very moment. Mehmed wasted no time. Almost immediately upon his ascension, he began meticulous preparations for the siege, demonstrating a level of foresight and logistical genius rarely seen in his era. He was a micromanager in the best possible sense, overseeing every detail. His first critical move was to construct the formidable Rumeli fortress on the European side of the Bosporus, directly opposite an existing Ottoman fortress, Anadolu Hisarı, built by his great-grandfather, Bayezid I. This new fortress, erected with astonishing speed in just 4 months, effectively cut off Constantinople from the Black Sea, preventing any relief or supply ships from reaching the city through that vital road. It was a chokehold, plain and simple, a testament to Ottoman engineering and Mehmed's unwavering resolve. Imagine building a massive, impenetrable gate across a critical waterway, practically overnight. The siege of Constantinople began in April 1453. The city's defenses were legendary, massive triple-layered walls that had repelled countless invaders for centuries. To overcome these, Mehmed ordered the construction of a massive artillery train, including the legendary urban cannon. a gigantic bombarding cannon cast by a Hungarian engineer named Urban, who had first offered his services to the Byzantines, only to be rejected due to lack of funds. This monstrous cannon, capable of firing stone balls weighing hundreds of kilograms, was a marvel of its time. Though prone to cracking and requiring immense effort to move and reload, it was effectively the superweapon of its day, designed to batter down walls that had seemed impregnable. The siege was an epic struggle. The Byzantines, led by their last emperor, Constantine IV Palaiologos, fought with desperate bravery, outnumbered and outgunned, but determined to defend their sacred city. The defenders, a mix of Greeks, Venetians, Genoese, and a handful of other volunteers, faced relentless Ottoman assaults by land and sea. Mehmed employed every tactic imaginable: incessant cannon fire, sapping tunnels dug under the walls, and repeated infantry assaults against the formidable fortifications. He even famously bypassed the great chain blocking the Golden Horn, Constantinople's natural harbor, by dragging his ships overland on greased logs from the Bosporus to the Golden Horn, a feat of engineering and audacity that shocked the defenders and essentially rendered their naval defenses obsolete. It was a move that modern strategists still marvel at. A true thinking outside the box moment that turned the tide of the naval engagement. Despite their ingenuity and tenacity, the Byzantine defenses slowly crumbled under the relentless Ottoman onslaught. The final assault came on May 29th, 1453. After weeks of continuous bombardment and failed attempts, the Ottomans launched a massive coordinated attack. Waves of irregular troops, followed by elite janissaries, surged against the breaches in the walls. Emperor Constantine V is said to have fought bravely until the very end, dying in the defense of his city. His body never definitively recovered. The city fell, marking not just the end of an empire, but the symbolic end of the Roman Empire itself, nearly a millennium after the fall of its Western counterpart. The fall of Constantinople sent shockwaves across Europe. It was a moment of profound psychological and political significance, signaling the definitive shift in power dynamics from the Christian West to the Islamic East. For the Ottomans, it was the crowning achievement, instantly elevating Mehmed II to legendary status and solidifying the empire's transcontinental identity. The city, soon to be renamed Istanbul, became the magnificent new capital of the Ottoman Empire, a vibrant hub of trade, culture, and power. Historians still argue about the long-term impact of the fall of Constantinople on European exploration and the Renaissance, with some suggesting it pushed Europeans to seek new trade routes to the east, leading to the Age of Discovery. It's a popular scholarly debate that asks whether Columbus's voyage was indirectly inspired by Mehmed's big win. The immediate aftermath saw some looting and destruction, but Mehmed II quickly asserted control, recognizing the immense value of his new capital. He immediately began rebuilding and repopulating the city, encouraging people of all faiths, Muslims, Christians, and Jews, to settle there, transforming it into a cosmopolitan metropolis. The capture of Constantinople was not just a military victory, it was a profound statement of imperial ambition, signifying the Ottoman Empire's arrival as a dominant world power, one that had finally laid claim to the legacy of ancient Rome, albeit through a very different lens. With Constantinople firmly in his grasp, now Istanbul, Mehmed II was no longer merely a sultan. He was Fatih, the conqueror, a title that forever cemented his place in history. His reign, lasting until 1481, transcended mere military victories, evolving into a period of profound transformation for the Ottoman Empire. He wasn't content with just a new capital. He aimed to forge a true empire, not just in territory, but in its very structure, law, and cultural identity. If the earlier sultans were like skilled carpenters, Mehmed was the master architect and interior designer, envisioning and then building the grand mansion that would be the Ottoman Empire for centuries to come. Immediately after the conquest, Mehmed set about repopulating and revitalizing Istanbul. Recognizing the city's strategic importance and symbolic value, he initiated a massive rebuilding program, constructing mosques, madrasas, markets, and public baths. He encouraged migration to the city, offering incentives to people of all backgrounds, whether Muslim, Christian, or Jewish, to settle and contribute to its resurgence. This wasn't just about making the city pretty. It was a deliberate policy to create a vibrant, multi-ethnic, and economically powerful capital worthy of a growing empire. He famously stated, "The city is now mine," and he truly made it his, a testament to his vision of a diverse and thriving imperial center. Beyond urban renewal, Mehmed II was a prodigious lawmaker and administrator. He undertook a sweeping legal reform, codifying the existing Ottoman laws and traditions into a comprehensive legal framework known as the Kanuname-i Ali Osman, or the Laws of the House of Osman. This legal code, meticulously crafted, covered everything from state administration, military organization, and finance to the treatment of non-Muslim subjects. It formalized the Devshirme system, regulated the Taimar system, and laid down clear principles for justice and governance. This wasn't just some dusty legal tome. It was the operating manual for the entire empire, ensuring consistency, efficiency, and reducing arbitrary rule. It also helped to centralize power firmly in the Sultan's hands, diminishing the influence of powerful provincial lords and tribal leaders. Mehmed also restructured the imperial administration, creating a more hierarchical and centralized bureaucracy. The Divan, or Imperial Council, became the central decision-making body, with the Grand Vizier at its head, serving as the Sultan's chief minister. He ensured that loyalty to the Sultan was paramount, often promoting individuals based on merit rather than birth, particularly those from the Kul slave system, who owed their entire careers to the Sultan. This strategy further cemented the Sultan's absolute authority, creating a loyal cadre of administrators who had no independent power base. It was a shrewd move, effectively ensuring that the Sultan remained the undisputed boss, much like a CEO who hires their own trusted team rather than inheriting existing management. In military matters, Mehmed continued to innovate and strengthen the Ottoman forces. The Janissaries, already elite, were further refined and integrated into the core of the standing army. He understood the importance of gunpowder technology, investing heavily in artillery production and incorporating it effectively into siege warfare and field battles. His campaigns after Constantinople were relentless. He conquered Serbia, Bosnia, Albania, despite fierce resistance from Skanderbeg and much of the Peloponnese, systematically bringing the remaining Balkan regions under direct Ottoman rule. His aim was clear: to secure the European flank and eliminate any lingering threats. He was, if you will, completing the set. His ambition wasn't limited to land. Mehmed recognized the strategic importance of naval power. He invested significantly in building a strong Ottoman navy, challenging the Venetian maritime dominance in the Aegean and Mediterranean. The long and arduous Ottoman-Venetian War, 1463–1479, was a testament to his determination to control key trade routes and islands. While Venice remained a formidable naval power, the Ottomans successfully acquired several important Aegean islands and asserted their presence in the eastern Mediterranean. This naval expansion was crucial for protecting trade and projecting power across the seas, showing that the Ottomans weren't just good on land, but could also make waves, literally. Mehmed Zeki was also a renowned patron of the arts, sciences, and literature. He was fluent in several languages, including Arabic, Persian, Greek, and Latin, and had a deep interest in both Eastern and Western cultures. He invited scholars, artists, and architects from across the Islamic world, and even from Europe, to his court in Istanbul, transforming the city into a vibrant intellectual and artistic hub. Under his patronage, magnificent mosques, bridges, and palaces were constructed, blending Islamic and Byzantine architectural styles. He commissioned works on history, astronomy, mathematics, and philosophy, fostering a vibrant intellectual environment. He was, in a way, the original Renaissance man, just with a turban instead of a Florentine hat. This cultural flourishing was not merely for show. It was a deliberate effort to project the image of a sophisticated, powerful, and enlightened empire, attracting talent and showcasing its newfound imperial grandeur. However, his reign was also marked by ruthless pragmatism, particularly concerning succession. Mehmed famously formalized the practice, later abandoned, of fratricide, allowing the incoming sultan to execute his brothers to prevent civil wars. This brutal policy, while ensuring a stable succession and preventing another interregnum, underscored the harsh realities of Ottoman power politics and the lengths to which sultans would go to preserve the empire's unity. Historians still argue whether this policy, though barbaric, was a necessary evil for the stability of such a vast and diverse empire, or if it was simply a cruel manifestation of absolute power. It's certainly one of those facts that makes you wince a little when you read about it. By the time of his death in 1481, Mehmed II had transformed the Ottoman Beylik into a formidable empire, one that stretched from the Danube to the Euphrates. He had given it a magnificent capital, a codified legal system, a centralized administration, and a powerful army and navy. His reign truly solidified the foundations of the classical Ottoman Empire, making it a force to be reckoned with on the world stage, an empire that demanded respect and often fear from its neighbors. After the monumental reign of Mehmed the Conqueror, the Ottoman Empire entered a period of consolidation and refinement under his son Bayezid II, 1481–1512, a more scholarly and a less overtly expansionist sultan. However, it was his son Selim Fez, known as Yavuz or the Grimstern, who would dramatically redirect the empire's focus and fundamentally reshape its territorial boundaries, transforming it into a dominant force in the Middle East. If Mehmed II built the house, Selim now added several vast new wings and perhaps a very serious, unsmiling butler. Selim's reign, though relatively short, 1512 to 1520, was a whirlwind of aggressive campaigns that shifted the Ottoman center of gravity from the Balkans towards the rich, ancient lands of the Arab world. Selim's path to the throne was, frankly, a classic example of Ottoman sibling rivalry. taken to its most brutal extreme. He forcefully deposed his own father, Bayezid II, and then, in a move that would make even Machiavelli blush, systematically eliminated all his brothers and nephews to ensure there would be absolutely no challenge to his rule. This ruthless adherence to the fratricide policy, while shocking, secured his position with an iron fist, leaving no doubt about who was in charge. He was a man who believed in decisive action, whether on the battlefield or in the palace, and he wasn't about to let family sentiment get in the way of imperial stability. With his internal position unassailable, Selim Hwayi turned his attention eastward, where two powerful rivals presented both threats and opportunities. The Safavid Empire in Persia, a Shiite Muslim dynasty, and the Mamluk Sultanate in Egypt and Syria. The conflict with the Safavids was particularly intense, fueled by religious animosity. Ottomans were Sunni, Safavids Shiite, and geopolitical rivalry over Anatolia. The Safavid ruler, Shah Ismail the Firm, was a charismatic figure who actively propagated Shiism and was seen as a dangerous ideological rival. This wasn't just a border dispute. It was a holy war in the making, a clash of theological titans, only with more swords and gunpowder. The decisive confrontation came at the Battle of Chaldiran in 1514. Selim Thamfern, with his technologically superior army, particularly in artillery and gunpowder infantry, the Janissaries, inflicted a crushing defeat on the Safavid forces, while Shah Ismail himself managed to escape. The battle severely weakened the Safavid state, halted its westward expansion, and allowed the Ottomans to annex eastern Anatolia and parts of northern Iraq, including important cities like Diyarbakir. This victory was monumental. It secured the Ottoman eastern frontier and cemented their status as the dominant Sunni power in the Islamic world. It also clearly demonstrated the tactical advantage of Ottoman gunpowder forces against cavalry-heavy armies, even those as formidable as the Safavids. It was a bit like bringing a tank to a sword fight, only the tank was a really loud, smoky cannon. Having neutralized the Safavid threat for the time being, Selim then pivoted south, setting his sights on the Mamluk Sultanate. The Mamluks, who controlled Egypt, Syria, and the holy cities of Mecca and Medina, were a formidable military power that had for centuries protected the heartlands of Islam and held significant prestige. However, their military was largely traditional, relying on cavalry, and had not fully embraced gunpowder technology to the same extent as the Ottomans. Selim saw an opportunity to control the lucrative spice trade routes, gain immense religious legitimacy by becoming the custodian of the two holy mosques, and secure control over the fertile Nile Valley. His campaign against the Mamluks was swift and devastating. In 1516, Selim Thambasta decisively defeated the Mamluk army at the Battle of Majdabik in Syria, resulting in the conquest of Syria, Palestine, and parts of the Arabian Peninsula. The Mamluk Sultan, Kansu al-Ghuri, died in the battle, effectively ending Mamluk rule in Syria. Not one to rest on his laurels, Selim pressed on into Egypt. The following year, in 1517, he delivered the final blow at the Battle of Ridania near Cairo, annihilating the remaining Mamluk forces and capturing Cairo. This conquest marked the end of the Mamluk Sultanate and brought Egypt, with its immense wealth and strategic importance, firmly under Ottoman control. The conquest of Egypt was transformative for the Ottoman Empire. It brought vast new resources, including the immense agricultural wealth of the Nile Valley, and control over crucial trade routes linking East and West. More significantly, it brought the caliphate under Ottoman suzerainty, while the exact historical transfer of the caliphate from the last Abbasid claimant in Cairo to the Ottoman Sultan is a subject of scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether the formal transfer of the caliphate to the Ottomans happened immediately after the conquest or was a later claim. What is undeniable is that Selim's conquests of the holy cities of Mecca and Medina and the Mamluk territories significantly enhanced the Ottoman Sultan's religious prestige and claims to leadership of the Ghaid Muslim world. The Ottoman Sultans now asserted themselves as the protectors of Islam's holiest sites and the rightful leaders of the Islamic community, a claim that added immense legitimacy to their imperial rule. Selimi's reign dramatically expanded the empire's geographical reach, adding vast territories in the Middle East and North Africa. The Ottoman Empire was now not just a power straddling Europe and Asia, but a dominant force in the Arab world, with direct access to the Red Sea and the Indian Ocean. He brought a vast and diverse array of new populations and cultures under Ottoman rule, making the empire even more multi-ethnic and multi-religious. By the time of his death in 1520, after only 8 years on the throne, Selim Firmolun had bequeathed to his son Suleiman an empire of unparalleled size, wealth, and prestige, setting the stage for its true golden age. He was a stern, uncompromising, and ultimately successful ruler who fundamentally redefined the scope and ambition of the Ottoman project. Following the intense whirlwind conquests of Selim Thumas, the Ottoman Empire reached its absolute zenith under his son Suleiman the Firm, universally known in the West as Suleiman the Magnificent, and in the East as Kanuni, the Lawgiver. His reign from 1520 to 1566 was the longest and arguably the most glorious in Ottoman history, a golden age of unparalleled military success, legal reform, cultural flourishing, and administrative sophistication. If Selim was the stern expansionist, Suleiman was the benevolent yet firm monarch who meticulously perfected and beautified the vast realm his father had assembled. He wasn't just a conqueror, he was an artist, a legislator, and a statesman, a true Renaissance ruler in an Islamic context. Suleiman inherited an empire that spanned 3 continents, was immensely wealthy, and possessed a formidable military machine. He immediately set about demonstrating his own prowess, proving that he was more than capable of living up to his formidable predecessors. His early campaigns were swift and decisive, aimed at securing key strategic objectives and further extending Ottoman influence into Europe. He understood that a strong leader needed to prove himself on the battlefield, even if he also loved poetry. One of his first major targets was the city of Belgrade, a crucial Hungarian fortress that had long been a thorn in the Ottoman side, blocking their advance into Central Europe. After a fierce siege, Belgrade fell in 1521, a mere year into his reign. This victory opened up the plains of Hungary to Ottoman expansion and was a clear signal to European powers that the Ottoman threat was far from diminished. It was like finally getting rid of that really annoying neighbor who keeps blocking your driveway. But Suleiman's ambitions extended beyond just land. He recognized the strategic importance of controlling the sea lanes. His forces, after a lengthy and costly siege, captured the island of Rhodes in 1522 from the Knights Hospitaller. This heavily fortified island, located in the southeastern Aegean Sea, had been a persistent base for Christian piracy and a serious impediment to Ottoman maritime trade and pilgrimage routes to Egypt and the Levant. Its fall secured Ottoman control over the eastern Mediterranean and further enhanced their naval capabilities. It was a tedious, prolonged affair, like trying to remove a very stubborn stain, but ultimately successful. While these military triumphs were spectacular, Suleiman's legacy as the lawgiver is perhaps even more significant. He undertook a comprehensive reform of the Ottoman legal system, distinguishing between Sharia, Islamic law, which dealt with religious matters and personal status, and Qanun, Sultanic law, which covered administrative, criminal, and financial matters. He harmonized and codified the diverse legal decrees of previous sultans, creating a unified legal framework that ensured justice and order across the vast empire. This legal compilation became known as the Qanunname-i Ali Osman, significantly expanding on Mehmed II's earlier work. This wasn't just about making new laws. It was about organizing and clarifying existing ones, creating a fairer and more efficient system of governance. It was like taking all the tangled wires behind your TV and neatly bundling them together. This legal framework would endure for centuries and serve as the blueprint for Ottoman administration. Historians still argue whether the Qanun laws truly superseded Sharia in practice, or if they merely complemented each other. But their comprehensive nature is undeniable. Suleiman's reign also witnessed an unprecedented flourishing of arts, architecture, and literature. He was a gifted poet himself, writing under the pen name Muhibi, and his court became a magnet for artists, poets, philosophers, and architects from across the Islamic world. The renowned architect, Mimar Sinan, considered one of the greatest architects in history, served under Suleiman, designing and constructing hundreds of magnificent mosques, bridges, palaces, and public buildings throughout the empire. The Suleymaniye Mosque in Istanbul, a masterpiece of Ottoman architecture, stands as a lasting testament to this golden age, a structure so grand it still makes you want to stop and stare. This cultural renaissance was a deliberate projection of Ottoman power and sophistication, demonstrating that the empire was not merely a military juggernaut, but a center of refined civilization. Under Suleiman, the Ottoman administrative structure reached its peak efficiency. The Divan, Imperial Council, was further formalized, and the Grand Vizier gained immense power, serving as the Sultan's absolute proxy. The system of provincial administration, relying on beys and pashas, ensured effective governance and revenue collection across the vast territories. The Taimar system provided the backbone of the cavalry, while the Janissaries remained the elite core of the standing army, a force feared and respected throughout Europe. This was a well-oiled machine, smoothly integrating diverse populations and resources into a coherent imperial system. Economically, the empire prospered under Suleiman. Control over major trade routes between East and West, coupled with the immense agricultural wealth of Egypt and the Levant, filled the imperial coffers. Istanbul, as the imperial capital, became a bustling metropolis, a vibrant hub of international commerce and cultural exchange, where goods and ideas flowed freely. This economic prosperity allowed for the funding of vast military campaigns and lavish cultural patronage, creating a virtuous cycle of imperial strength. Suleiman's reign represents the pinnacle of Ottoman power and influence, a period of self-confidence and sustained imperial success. He expanded the empire's borders, reformed its laws, and presided over a cultural golden age. He was a ruler who embodied the classical Ottoman ideal. A formidable warrior, a wise legislator, and a cultured patron of the arts. His policies and the institutions he fostered laid the groundwork for future generations, even as the seeds of eventual decline might have been subtly sown in the very vastness and complexity of the empire he so magnificently managed. Having firmly established his authority and begun the process of legal and cultural refinement, Suleiman the Magnificent quickly embarked on a series of military campaigns that further cemented Ottoman power and prestige, particularly in Europe. His initial conquests of Belgrade and Rhodes, as we discussed, were just the opening acts, setting the stage for even grander designs. He wasn't one to rest on his laurels. For Suleiman, success was merely an invitation to achieve even more. Much like a chef who, after perfecting a signature dish, immediately starts dreaming up an entirely new menu. The capture of Belgrade in 1521 was, as mentioned, a critical strategic victory. This formidable fortress city, nestled at the confluence of the Sava and Danube rivers, had long been a stubborn bastion of Hungarian defense, often called the door to Hungary or the gateway to Central Europe. Its fall was a major psychological blow to Christian Europe, signaling that the Ottomans were no longer merely raiding the Balkans, but were capable of cracking even the toughest nuts in their path. For the Ottomans, it opened up a vast new theater of operations, providing a perfect springboard for further incursions into the Hungarian plains. It was like finally getting a key to a locked room you'd been circling for ages. Following Belgrade, Suleiman turned his gaze to the island of Rhodes. This island, as you might recall, was the last bastion of the Knights Hospitaller in the Aegean. These military religious orders were a peculiar bunch, like medieval superheroes mixed with monastic vows, and from their heavily fortified base on Rhodes, they had for centuries plagued Ottoman shipping, intercepted Muslim pilgrims en route to Mecca, and acted as a Christian thorn in the side of an increasingly Muslim-dominated Eastern Mediterranean. They were, in essence, very well-armed medieval pirates with a holy mission, and they were quite annoying for the Ottomans. The Siege of Rhodes, launched in 1522, was an immense undertaking, a testament to Suleiman's determination and the sheer scale of Ottoman military logistics. It involved tens of thousands of Ottoman troops, hundreds of ships, and the deployment of massive artillery. The knights, led by their Grand Master Philippe Villiers de l'Isle Adam, defended with legendary bravery and tenacity, resisting the overwhelming Ottoman forces for months. The siege was brutal and bloody, marked by fierce hand-to-hand combat, devastating bombardments, and repeated, often costly, Ottoman assaults. It was one of those drawn-out conflicts where every inch of ground was contested, reminding everyone that even superior numbers don't guarantee an easy win. Despite the valiant defense, the sheer weight of Ottoman numbers, their relentless artillery barrage, and the eventual depletion of the defenders' resources proved insurmountable. After a siege lasting nearly 6 months, the knights, facing annihilation, eventually negotiated an honorable surrender in December 1522. Suleiman, in a display of calculated magnanimity and respect for their courage, allowed the remaining knights to depart with their lives and possessions, eventually relocating to Malta. This act, while perhaps a bit surprising, given the ferocity of the siege, was also shrewd diplomacy, showcasing Suleiman as a merciful victor, not just a brutal conqueror. It allowed him to secure the island without having to completely exterminate its defenders, a move that often prolonged conflicts. The fall of Rhodes was of immense strategic importance. It secured the vital maritime trade routes between Istanbul, Egypt, and the Levant, ensuring the free flow of Ottoman commerce and pilgrimage. It eliminated a perennial nest of Christian privateering in the eastern Mediterranean, making the seas safer for Ottoman vessels. With Rhodes under their control, the Ottomans solidified their naval dominance in the eastern Mediterranean, paving the way for further naval expansion and influence in the region, including eventually challenging Portuguese supremacy in the Red Sea and Indian Ocean. It was like finally removing that really stubborn pebble from your shoe. Much more comfortable sailing after that. These early conquests under Suleiman, particularly Belgrade and Rhodes, were not just about adding territory. They were about securing the empire's borders, eliminating persistent threats, and projecting an image of undeniable strength and capability. They demonstrated Suleiman's military acumen and his commitment to continuous expansion and consolidation. These victories bolstered the morale of the Ottoman army and people, reinforcing the belief that they were part of a divinely favored empire, destined for greatness. They also sent a clear, chilling message to the European powers. The Ottoman Empire was not just a temporary phenomenon. It was a deeply rooted and aggressively expanding force that now truly commanded its European flank and the eastern seas. The path was now clear for Suleiman to launch his most ambitious European campaign yet, aiming directly for the heart of Hungary, which would lead to an even more dramatic confrontation. With Belgrade secured and the troublesome Knights of Rhodes dispatched, Suleiman the Magnificent set his sights on the fertile plains of Hungary, aiming to completely dismantle the last major barrier to Ottoman expansion into Central Europe. His ultimate ambition, often whispered but never fully realized, was the symbolic and strategic capture of Vienna, the capital of the Habsburg monarchy, which would effectively open up the heart of Europe. This wasn't just another campaign. This was a statement, a declaration of intent to the entire Christian world that the Ottoman tide was still rising. The initial major confrontation came in 1526 at the Battle of Mohacs. This wasn't just a battle, it was a military masterclass from Suleiman. The Hungarian army, led by the young King Louis II, was decisively routed in a shockingly swift engagement that lasted mere hours. The strategic brilliance of the Ottoman use of artillery and their disciplined Janissary infantry against the less organized Hungarian cavalry proved devastating. King Louis II himself tragically drowned in a swamp while attempting to flee, marking a calamitous end to Hungarian independence. The victory at Mohacs was total and crushing, a moment of profound humiliation for Christian Europe. It effectively opened the gates of Central Europe to the Ottomans, like a giant, inconveniently timed floodgate that suddenly burst open. Following Mohacs, Suleiman marched into Hungary, capturing Buda, its capital. However, rather than immediately annexing the entire kingdom, he installed a loyal vassal, John Zapolya, as the King of Hungary, playing a complex game of political maneuvering against the Habsburgs, who also laid claim to the Hungarian throne. This indirect rule allowed the Ottomans to exert control without the full administrative burden of direct occupation, essentially turning Hungary into a buffer state and a battleground between the Ottomans and the Habsburgs for decades to come. The direct result of Mohács and the subsequent Ottoman presence in Hungary was the infamous Siege of Vienna in 1529. This was the moment that sent shivers down the spine of every European monarch. The Ottoman army, led by Suleiman himself, was massive, perhaps numbering over 100,000 men, a truly staggering force for the time. Their objective was clear: to capture the Habsburg capital and further extend the boundaries of the Ottoman Empire deep into Christian Europe. Imagine the sheer terror in Vienna as this colossal, feared army appeared on the horizon, ready to lay siege. It must have felt like the end of the world was nigh, especially given the rapid, terrifying successes of the Ottomans up until this point. However, the siege proved to be far more challenging than Suleiman or his generals had anticipated. Several factors conspired against the Ottomans. Firstly, their logistical train was severely hampered by heavy rains and muddy conditions during the long march from Istanbul to Vienna. Their powerful siege artillery, which had been so effective in previous conquests, got bogged down, and many of the largest cannons had to be abandoned along the way. It's hard to conquer a city when your biggest guns are stuck in the mud, like trying to bake a cake without the oven. Secondly, the defenders of Vienna, though outnumbered, were resolute. Led by Count Nicholas Salm, they put up a tenacious defense, repairing breaches in the walls as quickly as the Ottoman mines and cannon fire could create them. They were fighting for their homes and their very existence, and that kind of desperation can make defenders incredibly stubborn. The siege lasted for several weeks, characterized by continuous Ottoman bombardments and repeated assaults that were bravely repelled by the Viennese garrison and its civilian population. Finally, as autumn turned to winter, the weather became increasingly harsh. The Ottoman army, accustomed to warmer climates and long campaigns, began to suffer from disease, dwindling supplies, and the onset of cold, wet conditions. The logistical challenges became insurmountable. With winter approaching and the army's morale beginning to flag, Suleiman made the pragmatic but difficult decision to lift the siege in October 1529. This was not a defeat in battle, but a strategic withdrawal forced by logistics, weather, and the sheer resilience of the defenders. The Siege of Vienna of 1529 represents a critical turning point and is often referred to as the high water mark of Ottoman expansion into Central Europe. It demonstrated that even the mighty Suleiman had limits, and that the logistical challenges of projecting power so far from the empire's core were immense. While the Ottomans would continue to campaign in Hungary for decades, and would even attempt another siege of Vienna much later, 1529 marked the furthest they would ever penetrate directly into Habsburg territory with such a massive force. Historians still argue whether a successful capture of Vienna would have led to a permanent Ottoman presence deep in Central Europe, or if the sheer size and cultural differences would have made such an occupation unsustainable in the long run. It's one of those tantalizing what-if questions that keeps academics busy, pondering alternate realities where perhaps everyone in Vienna suddenly started drinking Turkish coffee. Despite the failure to take Vienna, Suleiman's campaigns in Hungary continued for many years, leading to the eventual direct annexation of much of central Hungary, including Buda, by 1541. The vast majority of the Hungarian plain became an integral part of the Ottoman Empire for over 150 years, governed directly by Ottoman pashas. This established a long and often brutal frontier between the Ottoman and Habsburg empires, a constant state of low-level conflict and occasional major wars. So, while Vienna stood, much of Hungary fell, and the legacy of Suleiman's ambition indelibly shaped the political and cultural landscape of Central Europe for centuries to come, creating a vast Islamic empire on the very doorstep of Western Christendom. While Suleiman's land campaigns pushed the Ottoman frontier deep into Central Europe, his ambition was equally matched on the high seas. Under his magnificent gaze, the Ottoman Empire truly blossomed into a formidable naval power, challenging the established maritime supremacy of Venice and Spain, and extending its influence across the Mediterranean, the Red Sea, and even into the Indian Ocean. If his armies were the iron fist, his fleets were the long, reaching arm that gripped distant shores. This naval dominance was crucial, not just for prestige, but for controlling vital trade routes and projecting power across the empire's vast maritime borders, especially after the conquests of Egypt and the Levant. The Ottomans, having inherited a small navy from their Byzantine predecessors and developed coastal capabilities during their Anatolian expansion, quickly scaled up their maritime endeavors. The capture of Rhodes, as we discussed, was a key step in asserting control over the eastern Mediterranean. But Suleiman understood that to truly dominate, he needed a fleet that could rival or even surpass the best of Europe. To achieve this, he brought in some of the most skilled and feared corsairs and admirals of the age. The most famous of these was Hayreddin Barbarossa, a legendary figure who rose from being a privateer in the Maghreb to become the Grand Admiral of the Ottoman fleet, Kapudan Pasha. Barbarossa, along with his brother, Oruç Reis before him, had carved out a formidable reputation in the Western Mediterranean, commanding fleets of swift galleys and conducting raids that struck fear into the hearts of European merchants and coastal towns. Suleiman, ever the pragmatist, recognized raw talent when he saw it, and in 1533 he invited Barbarossa to Istanbul, offering him the command of the entire Ottoman navy. It was like hiring the world's best, most successful pirate to run your national navy. Brilliant, if a bit unconventional. Under Barbarossa's leadership, the Ottoman navy underwent a rapid transformation. New shipyards were built, existing ones expanded, and skilled shipwrights and sailors were recruited from across the empire and beyond. The focus was primarily on galleys, which were well suited for the Mediterranean's calmer waters, allowing for swift maneuvers and the deployment of infantry in close quarters combat. These weren't just transport ships. They were floating fortresses, bristling with cannons and packed with elite janissaries. The peak of Ottoman naval power under Suleiman and Barbarossa came with the decisive Battle of Preveza in 1538. Here, the Ottoman fleet, led by Barbarossa, faced a massive Holy League fleet, an allied Christian armada composed primarily of ships from Spain, Venice, Genoa, and the Papal States, commanded by the celebrated Genoese admiral Andrea Doria. The battle was a resounding Ottoman victory. Despite the numerical superiority of the Holy League fleet, Barbarossa's tactical genius, combined with the discipline and firepower of the Ottoman galleys, overwhelmed the Christian forces. This victory secured Ottoman dominance in the eastern and central Mediterranean for decades, forcing European powers to acknowledge the Ottoman presence as a major naval force. It was essentially the Ottoman equivalent of someone yelling, "We rule the waves," only with more cannon smoke and less tea. This control of the Mediterranean had profound economic and strategic implications. It protected the vital trade routes that brought spices, silks, and other valuable commodities from the east to the Ottoman heartland, generating immense wealth for the imperial treasury. It also facilitated the movement of Ottoman troops and supplies, allowing for the effective projection of power across the empire's vast coastal regions. Ottoman naval power wasn't just about fighting. It was about connecting the disparate parts of their sprawling empire, from North Africa to the Levant. Beyond the Mediterranean, Ottoman naval power extended into the Red Sea. With the conquest of Egypt, the Ottomans gained control over the strategic port of Suez and the Red Sea trade. This brought them into direct confrontation with the Portuguese Empire, which had, by this point, established a strong naval presence in the Indian Ocean, effectively bypassing the traditional land routes and threatening Ottoman economic interests. Suleiman dispatched fleets from Suez to challenge the Portuguese, engaging in a series of naval skirmishes and expeditions into the Indian Ocean. While the Ottomans never managed to dislodge the Portuguese entirely from the Indian Ocean, they successfully defended their control over the Red Sea, ensured the safety of the pilgrim routes to Mecca, and prevented Portuguese incursions into Ottoman heartlands. This little-known naval rivalry in the Indian Ocean is a fascinating mainstream historical fact that often gets overshadowed by the more famous Mediterranean conflicts. It shows just how globally ambitious the Ottomans were, even if they sometimes get typecast as just a land-based power. By the end of Suleiman's reign, the Ottoman Empire was a truly formidable sea power, controlling almost the entire Mediterranean coastline from the Balkans to North Africa, as well as the Red Sea. This naval strength was an indispensable component of their imperial might, allowing them to secure trade, defend their vast coastlines, and project power far beyond their land borders. The image of the Ottoman Empire as solely a land-based force is, to be frank, a bit of an incomplete picture. Their mastery of the waves was just as significant to their golden age. It was a golden age that gleamed not just from the sun reflecting off minarets, but also off the polished decks of a powerful fleet. Beyond the impressive military campaigns and territorial expansion that defined Suleiman the Magnificent's reign, the true genius of the classical Ottoman Empire lay in its sophisticated and remarkably enduring internal structures. This wasn't just a collection of conquered lands. It was a meticulously organized system, a sprawling administrative machine designed to govern a diverse array of peoples, extract resources efficiently, and maintain control over vast distances. Imagine a giant, well-oiled clock with countless intricate gears, all working in harmony. That's a good metaphor for the Ottoman state at its peak. At the very apex of this pyramid was the Sultan, who was not merely a king, but held absolute temporal and spiritual authority. He was the ultimate legislator, judge, and commander-in-chief, a figure whose word was law and whose legitimacy was rooted in both his Ottoman lineage and, after Selim Thums, his claim to the caliphate, signifying his role as the protector of Islam. However, despite this absolute power, The Sultan was expected to rule justly, adhering to both Islamic law, Sharia, and the imperial decrees, Qanun, that Suleiman himself had so diligently codified. This balance between absolute authority and adherence to law was a cornerstone of Ottoman governance. Directly below the Sultan was the Divan-ı-Hümayun, or Imperial Council. This was the empire's central administrative and executive body, akin to a modern cabinet, where all major decisions were deliberated and implemented. Presiding over the Divan was the Grand Vizier, the Sultan's chief minister and absolute proxy, holding immense power and authority. The Grand Vizier was essentially the chief operating officer of the entire empire, responsible for executing the Sultan's will and overseeing all aspects of government, from military logistics to judicial appointments. Below him were other viziers, each responsible for specific departments, alongside other high-ranking officials like the Defterdar, chief financial officer, and the Nishancher, chancellor, responsible for imperial decrees and records. This highly centralized system allowed for swift decision-making and efficient command and control across the sprawling empire. The military organization was the backbone of the Ottoman state, and it was remarkably innovative for its time. The two main pillars were the Janissaries and the Sipahis. The Janissaries, as we've discussed, were the elite standing infantry, recruited primarily through the Devshirme system. They were highly disciplined, well-trained, and equipped with the latest gunpowder weapons, making them one of the most feared fighting forces in Europe. Their loyalty was directly to the Sultan, ensuring they acted as a counterweight to any potentially rebellious regional lords. The Sipahis, on the other hand, were the feudal cavalry, whose military service was tied to the Timar system. A Timar was a land grant given in return for military service, with the Sipahi collecting taxes from his assigned lands and using that revenue to maintain himself and his retinue of armed horsemen. This system provided a cost-effective way to mobilize a large cavalry force without burdening the central treasury, and it also served as an effective method of administering newly conquered territories. The Ottoman Empire was also characterized by its unique system of social organization, particularly its treatment of non-Muslims. The millet system was a crucial component of this. Within the Ottoman Empire, religious communities, millets, were granted a significant degree of internal autonomy. The Greek Orthodox, Armenian Orthodox, and Jewish communities, among others, were allowed to govern themselves according to their own religious laws and customs, collect their own taxes, and manage their own schools and courts, so long as they remained loyal to the Sultan and paid their taxes. This wasn't some perfectly egalitarian utopia, mind you. Non-Muslims were still considered second-class citizens, dhimmis, and faced certain restrictions, like not being allowed to bear arms or testify against a Muslim in certain legal cases. But for the era, this system offered a remarkable degree of religious tolerance and self-governance, often contrasting sharply with the religious persecutions seen in contemporary Europe. Historians still argue whether the millet system was primarily a benevolent policy or simply a pragmatic way to manage diverse populations. But its effectiveness in maintaining social cohesion is undeniable. It was, in a way, like an early form of federalism, where local communities had a good deal of say in their own day-to-day affairs, so long as they paid their dues to the central authority. Economically, the empire thrived on its control of key trade routes. Istanbul served as a massive hub connecting East and West, with goods flowing from Asia, Africa, and Europe. The state heavily regulated trade, built caravanserais and bridges to facilitate commerce, and maintained a stable currency. The fertile lands of Egypt and Mesopotamia provided abundant agricultural wealth, while mining in the Balkans supplied precious metals. The Vakf system, a form of charitable endowment, also played a significant role in the economy and social welfare, funding mosques, hospitals, bridges, and schools. The judicial system, distinct from the administrative structure, was also highly developed. Islamic judges, or qadis, administered Sharia law, while separate courts dealt with the Qanun. Appeals could eventually reach the Sultan's court, ensuring a degree of accountability, at least in theory. This legal infrastructure, combined with an extensive network of spies and informants, helped to maintain order and detect dissent, making the empire remarkably stable for centuries. So it wasn't just about military might, it was about smart, organized governance, allowing the Ottomans to rule a vast, diverse population with surprising longevity. Central to the success, and indeed the very identity of the classical Ottoman Empire, was a unique and often misunderstood military institution: the Janissary Corps. These were not just soldiers. They were the Sultan's personal army, an elite, highly disciplined infantry force that served as the backbone of the Ottoman military might for centuries. If the entire Ottoman structure was a well-oiled clock, the Janissaries were the finely tuned escapement, providing consistent, precise, and devastating power when needed. Their origins, training, and evolving role within the empire offer a fascinating glimpse into the ingenious and sometimes brutal mechanisms of Ottoman rule. The Janissaries were primarily recruited through the infamous devshirme system, often translated as child levy or blood tax. This controversial practice involved the periodic collection of Christian boys, typically aged between 8 and 18, from rural areas of the Balkans and occasionally Anatolia. These boys were then forcibly converted to Islam, given Turkish names, and subjected to a rigorous training regimen designed to completely sever their ties with their former lives and instill absolute loyalty to the Sultan. It sounds harsh, and it was, but for many, it also represented a strange, unexpected path to power and influence that would have been impossible in their birth communities. Imagine being a young farm boy and suddenly finding yourself on a path that could lead to being a general or a governor. Upon being recruited, these boys underwent intensive physical and intellectual training. They learned Turkish, Arabic, and Persian, were educated in Islamic theology and law, and underwent strenuous physical conditioning. The most promising talents were identified early. Some were groomed for high administrative positions, while the majority were trained for military service. Their initial training often involved working on farms or with artisans to build physical strength and practical skills before entering the barracks for specialized military instruction. This wasn't just boot camp. It was a complete re-education, a cultural assimilation on steroids. The Janissaries were the first standing professional army in Europe, or close to it, depending on how you define standing army, paid a regular salary, and housed in barracks. Unlike feudal levies, who owed allegiance to local lords, the Janissaries were kul, servants directly beholden to the Sultan, effectively his personal slaves in a hierarchical, institutional sense. though they often held immense power. This direct loyalty made them incredibly reliable and prevented them from developing independent power bases that could challenge the central authority, a common problem in many other empires. They were also forbidden from marrying or engaging in trade in their early careers, ensuring their complete dedication to military service. Their primary weapon was the musket, and they were among the first infantry units in the world to adopt and master gunpowder firearms. Their discipline, combined with their advanced weaponry, made them a formidable force on the battlefield, often breaking the ranks of enemy cavalry charges with volley fire. They were experts in siege warfare, skirmishing, and holding the line, and their distinctive uniforms, especially their tall white felt hats, burq, made them recognizable and feared across Europe. When the Janissaries appeared on the battlefield, it generally meant the Sultan was serious. However, over centuries, the Janissaries' role began to evolve, and not always for the better. By the late 16th and 17th centuries, the strict discipline and rules of the corps began to erode. They started to demand the right to marry, own property, and enroll their own sons into the corps, transforming it from an elite slave army into a more hereditary and politically powerful guild. This shift gradually led to a decline in their military effectiveness and an increase in their political meddling. They became kingmakers, often playing a decisive role in succession struggles, and even deposing sultans they deemed unsatisfactory. Historians still argue whether the Janissaries' growing political power was an inevitable consequence of their unique position, or if it could have been curbed by stronger sultans. It's like a beloved pet that slowly but surely starts running the entire household. Their growing conservatism also became an impediment to military modernization. They often resisted the adoption of new tactics or technologies that challenged their traditional methods, fearing it would diminish their unique status. This resistance to reform would prove costly as European armies began to rapidly modernize in the 17th and 18th centuries. While they remained a formidable force for a long time, their internal problems began to outweigh their external utility. Despite their later decline, the Janissaries' early centuries represent one of the most remarkable military innovations in history. They were a professional standing army, disciplined, well-equipped, and fiercely loyal to their direct commander, the Sultan. Their unique recruitment and training system allowed the Ottomans to tap into a continuous supply of talent from across their diverse empire, creating a fighting force that was consistently superior to many of its contemporaries. They were the shock troops, the urban garrisons, and the elite guards, and their very existence symbolized the centralized, absolute power of the Ottoman Sultanate. Even as their influence waned and became detrimental, their historical impact on the rise of the Ottoman Empire is undeniable, proving that sometimes even controversial and morally dubious systems can, for a time, be astonishingly effective. As the 17th century dawned, the brilliant luster of Suleiman the Magnificent's golden age began, subtly at first, to tarnish. While the empire still appeared outwardly formidable, boasting immense wealth and vast territories, whispers of decline began to emerge, not with a sudden crash, but with a gradual, almost imperceptible weakening of the very foundations that had underpinned its success. It was less like a sudden collapse and more like a slow, stately ship, once at full sail, beginning to lose wind and drift slightly off course, its timbers creaking under the strain of its own vastness. One of the most significant factors contributing to this creeping stagnation was the shift in the nature of the Sultanate itself. After Suleiman, a succession of less capable and often short-lived sultans ascended the throne. Many spent their lives largely confined within the harem, raised in luxury and relative isolation, with little direct experience in governance or military command. This contrasted sharply with earlier sultans who were often seasoned warriors and administrators, personally leading campaigns and engaging directly with the divan, the golden cage of the Topkapi Palace, designed to protect the Sultan, ironically made many of them ill-prepared for the immense responsibilities of ruling a vast empire. Imagine trying to run a multinational corporation from your bedroom with limited access to actual business operations. It's a recipe for disaster. This decline in sultanic leadership led to an increasing reliance on the Grand Viziers, who became the de facto rulers of the empire. While some Grand Viziers were highly capable, like the Kuprulu family later on, the frequent changes in office due to political intrigue, factionalism, and court manipulation led to instability and a lack of long-term vision in policy making. The once centralized authority began to diffuse, creating opportunities for corruption and infighting among ambitious bureaucrats and courtiers. The sheer number of viziers often meant a power vacuum at the top, allowing various factions to pull the strings. Another critical area of subtle decline was the Timar system, the decentralized land grant system that had for centuries provided the backbone of the Ottoman cavalry. Over time, the system became increasingly prone to corruption and abuse. Timars were sometimes converted into hereditary holdings, or given to individuals who did not fulfill their military obligations, or even sold off, leading to a decline in the quality and quantity of the Sipahi cavalry. This meant the empire increasingly relied on the Janissaries, whose own quality, as we discussed, was simultaneously beginning to erode. It was like finding out your essential delivery service was slowly replacing its reliable drivers with people who just kind of showed up. The Janissaries themselves, once the ultimate expression of Ottoman military might, were becoming a significant problem. Their growing political power and increasing demands for privileges led to their transformation from an elite fighting force into a conservative, often disruptive, political faction. They gained the right to marry, enroll their children in the corps, and engage in trade, which diluted their military focus and transformed them into a hereditary caste rather than a meritocratic elite. Their resistance to military reforms and new technologies, coupled with their frequent revolts and demands for higher pay, made them an impediment to progress rather than an instrument of conquest. They went from being the Sultan's loyal guard dogs to a pack of very demanding, often disobedient, family pets. Historians still argue whether the decline of the Janissaries was a symptom or a cause of broader Ottoman decline, but their role in hindering military modernization is undeniable. Economically, the empire also faced new challenges. The age of discovery, with new sea routes bypassing the traditional land-based trade routes that the Ottomans had controlled, like the Silk Road, began to impact imperial revenues. While not an immediate collapse, the shift in global trade patterns meant that the Ottoman Empire, which had long profited immensely from being the middleman, now had less direct control over the most lucrative East-West commerce. The influx of cheap silver from the Americas into Europe also led to rampant inflation within the Ottoman Empire, destabilizing its economy and devaluing its currency. This price revolution hit fixed income timer holders and soldiers particularly hard, leading to unrest and a further weakening of the old systems. Furthermore, a period of climatic change and social unrest, sometimes referred to as the Little Ice Age, led to agricultural crises and rural depopulation in certain areas, particularly in Anatolia, exacerbating economic difficulties. The long and costly wars against the Habsburgs and Safavids, while often resulting in territorial gains or stalemates, drained the imperial treasury and strained manpower resources without yielding the massive spoils of conquest that had funded earlier expansion. These protracted conflicts prevented the empire from focusing on much-needed internal reforms. So while the Ottoman Empire was far from collapsing in the 17th century, it would, after all, endure for another 300 years. The seeds of its later decline were clearly being sown during this period. The decline in the quality of sultanic leadership, the increasing corruption within the military and administrative systems, the resistance to reform from entrenched institutions like the Janissaries, and new global economic realities all contributed to a gradual but definite weakening. The empire was still vast and powerful, but its internal machinery was becoming creaky. A magnificent ship sailing through increasingly turbulent waters, with a less than steady hand at the helm. As the empire drifted into the 17th century, the subtle creaks and groans of the Ottoman administrative ship became more pronounced, nowhere more visibly than within the hallowed, yet often scandalous, confines of the imperial palace. The rise of palace intrigue and the increasing influence of the harem fundamentally altered the dynamics of power, contributing significantly to political instability and a shift away from the meritocratic governance that had characterized the empire's golden age. It was like a highly efficient corporate boardroom slowly devolving into a family drama where whispered rumors and backroom deals replaced strategic planning. The central issue stemmed from the change in the method of royal succession and the upbringing of the Shehzades, princes. After Suleiman the Magnificent, the practice of royal fratricide, though brutal, was gradually abandoned. Instead of being sent to govern provinces and gain administrative and military experience, a tradition that had produced formidable sultans like Mehmed II and Suleiman, princes were increasingly confined to the cafes, the cage, a secluded part of the harem. Here they lived in luxurious isolation, often for decades, away from public life and practical governance, awaiting their turn on the throne. While this avoided the bloody succession wars of the interregnum, it produced sultans who were often inexperienced, psychologically fragile, or easily manipulated, unprepared for the immense responsibilities of ruling a vast empire. Imagine preparing for the world's most demanding job by spending your entire life playing video games in a gilded cage. This vacuum of experienced leadership at the very top naturally led to an increase in the power and influence of other actors within the palace, most notably the Grand Viziers and the powerful women of the harem. The harem, far from being just a collection of concubines, was a complex hierarchical institution, primarily run by the Valide Sultan, the Sultan's mother, and other influential female figures. like the sultan's chief consorts or sisters. These women, particularly the Walid Sultan, often wielded immense unofficial power, acting as regents for young or incapable sultans, advising on state policy and influencing appointments to high office. This period is sometimes referred to as the Sultanate of Women by some historians, though this term is subject to much scholarly debate, with some arguing it oversimplifies the complex power dynamics. Nonetheless, the undeniable influence of these powerful female figures became a defining characteristic of 17th century Ottoman politics. The influence of the harem, however, was a double-edged sword. While some Walide sultans, like Kösem Sultan, were remarkably astute politicians who provided stability during periods of weak sultanic rule, their primary loyalty was often to their own sons and to the dynastic family, not necessarily to the best interests of the empire as a whole. This led to intense rivalries within the harem, as different factions vied for influence, using bribery, intrigue, and even assassination to promote their favorites and undermine their rivals. This constant jockeying for position destabilized the court and distracted from pressing imperial matters. It was like a highly dramatic reality TV show, but with actual empires at stake. The Grand Viziers, serving as the Sultan's chief executives, also became incredibly powerful during this period, often acting as de facto rulers. When a strong and capable Grand Vizier emerged, like the members of the Köprülü family, who dominated the office for several decades in the late 17th century, they could provide much-needed stability and initiate reforms. However, their power was always precarious, dependent on the whim of the Sultan or the shifting tides of palace politics. A weak Grand Vizier could lead to widespread corruption and administrative paralysis, while a strong one could easily be overthrown by rivals or a jealous sultan. The average tenure of a Grand Vizier during this period significantly shortened compared to earlier centuries, reflecting the increased instability. This constant churn at the top led to a significant increase in corruption throughout the administrative apparatus, with high offices often bought and sold, and loyalty shifting with the winds of palace intrigue. Personal gain often overshadowed public service. Appointments were made based on patronage rather than merit, leading to a decline in the quality of governance at all levels. Funds that should have gone to the imperial treasury were siphoned off, further weakening the empire's financial health. It was like a game of musical chairs, where the music kept stopping, and everyone rushed to grab a seat, often at the expense of proper governance. Furthermore, the Janissaries, already growing in political influence, became key players in this web of intrigue. Their barracks were often hotbeds of dissent and conspiracy, and they frequently used their military power to exert political pressure, demanding favors, deposing unpopular officials, and even orchestrating the removal of sultans. Their involvement in palace coups and their increasingly insubordinate behavior severely undermined the central authority and the efficiency of the military. Historians still argue about the extent to which these internal palace dynamics were a direct cause of decline or simply a symptom of deeper underlying issues. But their corrosive effect on governance is undeniable. Ultimately, the rise of palace intrigue and the increasing influence of the harem and powerful Grand Viziers meant that decisions were often made based on internal court politics rather than long-term strategic vision or the needs of the empire. This internal focus, combined with the lack of experienced leadership from the sultans themselves, left the Ottoman state less equipped to respond to the growing external challenges from rapidly modernizing European powers. The magnificent engine of the empire, once so efficiently run, was now sputtering, choked by the machinations of those closest to the very top. While the internal machinations of the palace were steadily eroding the Ottoman state from within, an equally perilous shift was occurring externally. The empire's once fearsome military edge began to dull. For centuries, Ottoman armies had been the envy and terror of Europe, renowned for their discipline, organization, and mastery of gunpowder technology. However, by the late 17th and certainly by the 18th century, a critical technological and tactical gap began to emerge between the Ottoman military and the rapidly modernizing armies of Europe. It was like owning the world's fastest racing car, only to realize your competitors had secretly developed jet engines while you were busy admiring your hubcaps. The primary reason for this stagnation was a deeply ingrained conservatism within the Ottoman military establishment, particularly among the Janissaries. As discussed, these once elite infantry units, through their growing political power and hereditary nature, became resistant to change. They viewed new military technologies and tactics, particularly those originating from Europe, with suspicion and even contempt. Why adopt new methods when the old ones had brought so much success? This resistance wasn't just about tradition. It was about protecting their privileges and their unique position within the military hierarchy. They resisted the adoption of modern muskets with flintlock mechanisms, preferring their older, less efficient matchlocks, and were slow to embrace new drill formations and logistical improvements that were becoming standard in European armies. Imagine trying to convince a well-established, powerful union that they need to totally retrain and abandon their old tools. It's a tough sell. Meanwhile, European powers, particularly the Habsburg monarchy, Russia, and eventually Prussia, were undergoing a profound military revolution. This involved rapid advancements in artillery design, musket technology, like the flintlock rifle and later the bayonet, military drill, logistical support, and the professionalization of officer corps. European armies became more centralized, more disciplined, and far more adaptable. They invested heavily in military academies, cartography, and engineering, systematically improving every aspect of warfare. While the Ottomans clung to their proven methods, Europe was rapidly innovating, creating a widening gulf in military capability. It was like one side was still using abacuses while the other had invented calculators. The consequences of this military stagnation became painfully evident on the battlefield. The Ottoman army, while still capable of raising vast numbers of troops, often found itself outmaneuvered and outgunned by smaller but more technologically advanced and tactically superior European forces. Sieges, once an Ottoman fort, became increasingly difficult as European fortifications improved and their artillery caught up or even surpassed Ottoman capabilities. The effectiveness of the Sipahi cavalry also declined as European infantry developed better defensive formations and firepower. The series of devastating defeats suffered by the Ottomans in the Great Turkish War, 1683 to 1699, against the Holy League, a coalition of Habsburg Austria, Poland, Lithuania, Venice, and Russia, laid bare the extent of this military disparity. The failure of the Second Siege of Vienna in 1683, a massive Ottoman undertaking, was a turning point. Despite initial successes, the Ottoman army was ultimately defeated by a combined relief force led by Polish King John III, Sobieski, and Habsburg forces under Charles V, Duke of Lorraine. This defeat shattered the myth of Ottoman invincibility and led to a prolonged war of attrition that saw the Ottomans lose vast territories in Hungary and the Balkans. This was more than just a battle. It was a psychological turning point, signaling that the tide had decisively turned against the Ottomans in Europe. Subsequent wars in the 18th century further highlighted the problem. Against Russia, a rapidly rising power under figures like Peter the Great and Catherine the Great, the Ottomans repeatedly suffered defeats, losing control of territories on the Black Sea and facing increasing pressure in the Crimea. The Russian military, thoroughly modernized and aggressive, proved to be a formidable new adversary. The loss of territories was not just a blow to prestige. It meant a loss of revenue, manpower, and strategic depth, further exacerbating the empire's financial woes. Attempts at military reform within the Ottoman Empire were often met with fierce resistance, particularly from the Janissaries, who saw any changes as a threat to their privileges and traditional role. Sultans and reform-minded officials who tried to introduce new training methods, reorganize units, or adopt European weapons often faced revolts and even assassination. It was a classic catch-22. The very institution that needed reform was the most powerful obstacle to it. This internal resistance meant that while individual Ottoman leaders might recognize the need for change, implementing it on a systemic level was incredibly difficult, if not impossible, for long stretches of time. Historians still argue about the exact moment when the Ottoman military parity with Europe ended. Some point to the Battle of Mohács, where gunpowder proved so decisive, while others argue it was much later with the failure at Vienna. What is undeniable is that the late 17th and 18th centuries saw the gap widen to an unsustainable degree. The empire, which had once innovated and excelled in military technology and organization, had become complacent, allowing its rivals to surge ahead. This military stagnation, combined with internal political and economic issues, was a major contributing factor to the empire's long, slow decline. The sword that had carved out an empire was growing blunt, and its wielders were stubbornly refusing to sharpen it. As the Ottoman military machine sputtered and its internal palace politics grew increasingly convoluted, the empire also found itself grappling with mounting economic woes. The vibrant prosperity of Suleiman's era, fueled by control of crucial trade routes and immense agricultural wealth, slowly gave way to a period of financial strain, inflation, and structural imbalances that chipped away at the empire's stability. It was like a grand old house that once had limitless funds, slowly finding its budget getting tighter, with cracks appearing in the plaster and the plumbing starting to leak. One of the most significant external factors impacting the Ottoman economy was the Age of Discovery and the subsequent shift in global trade routes. For centuries, the Ottoman Empire had been the indispensable middleman, controlling the lucrative overland Silk Road and maritime spice routes that connected Asia and Europe. Goods from the east had to pass through Ottoman territories, generating immense customs duties and enriching Ottoman merchants. However, the Portuguese and later other European powers successfully circumnavigated Africa, establishing direct sea routes to India and the Far East. This didn't immediately bankrupt the Ottomans, but it gradually diminished the importance of their traditional trade monopolies. Imagine a toll booth operator suddenly finding out a new free highway has opened up right next to their road. Compounding this was the price revolution in Europe, driven by the massive influx of silver from the Americas. This silver, flowing into European economies, caused widespread inflation across the continent, and it inevitably spilled over into the Ottoman Empire, which was closely integrated into the European economic system. The Ottoman currency, the akçe, became devalued, leading to rapidly rising prices for goods and services. This hyperinflation wreaked havoc on the empire's fixed-income earners, particularly the Sipahis, whose Taimar revenues were fixed, and the Janissaries, whose salaries became worth less and less. This economic hardship led to widespread discontent, frequent revolts, and an increase in corruption as officials and soldiers sought alternative ways to make ends meet. It was like living in a time when your weekly grocery bill suddenly doubled, then tripled, with no corresponding raise in salary. The traditional Taimar system, already suffering from corruption and the granting of Taimars to non-military personnel, was further undermined by these economic pressures. As Taimar revenues became insufficient to maintain cavalry units, the system, which had been the backbone of the Ottoman provincial administration and military for centuries, began to crumble. The state increasingly had to rely on tax farming, a system where the right to collect taxes was sold to the highest bidder, who then squeezed the local population to maximize their profit. While this provided immediate revenue for the central treasury, it often led to severe exploitation of the peasantry, social unrest, and long-term damage to agricultural productivity. It was a short-term fix with dire long-term consequences, like borrowing money from a loan shark to pay your bills. Furthermore, the long and frequent wars against the Habsburgs, Safavids, and later Russia were incredibly costly. Unlike earlier periods of rapid expansion, when conquests often brought in more wealth than they cost, these later wars were often protracted, defensive, and yielded little in the way of new, rich territories. The enormous expense of maintaining a large standing army, purchasing modern armaments, even if they were sometimes outdated compared to European ones, and funding lengthy sieges drained the imperial treasury. To cope with these expenses, the state resorted to increasingly desperate measures, such as debasing the coinage, reducing the silver content, raising new taxes, and selling off government offices and privileges, all of which further destabilized the economy and encouraged corruption. The economic difficulties also led to a decline in key industries and a loss of competitiveness. While Ottoman artisans were skilled, the empire was slower to adopt new production techniques and technologies compared to industrializing Europe. The capitulations, a series of treaties granting European merchants favorable trade terms and legal protections within the Ottoman Empire, also contributed to economic weakness by giving European powers an advantage and making it harder for local Ottoman industries to compete. It's like inviting foreign businesses to set up shop in your town, but giving them special tax breaks and letting them ignore some of your rules, making it really hard for your local businesses to compete. The empire's vast size, once a strength, also became a logistical and economic burden. Maintaining administrative control and communication over such a sprawling domain, especially with a weakening central authority, became increasingly difficult and expensive. Peripheral regions often managed to avoid paying taxes or asserted greater economic autonomy, further reducing central revenues. In essence, the Ottoman Empire, once an economic powerhouse at the crossroads of global trade, found itself caught in a perfect storm of external economic shifts, internal financial mismanagement, and the crippling costs of incessant warfare. The robust economic engine that had fueled centuries of expansion began to sputter, its gears grinding, no longer able to support the vast weight of an empire that was struggling to adapt to a rapidly changing global landscape. This financial distress permeated every level of society, from the impoverished peasant to the disgruntled janissary, and contributed significantly to the overall narrative of decline, proving that even empires, just like people, can struggle when their wallet gets thin. The subtle decay within the palace, the growing conservatism of the military, and the insidious economic pressures all converged to produce an undeniable and often humiliating outcome: significant territorial losses. For an empire built on conquest, the forced relinquishment of land was not just a strategic setback. It was a profound psychological blow, shattering the aura of invincibility that had surrounded the Ottomans for centuries. The turning point, the stark moment when the empire had to definitively acknowledge its weakening position, came with the Treaty of Karlowitz in 1699. It was like suddenly realizing you're not the biggest kid on the playground anymore, and you have to give back some of the toys you'd taken. For decades leading up to Karlowitz, the Ottoman Empire had been embroiled in the Great Turkish War, 1683-1699, a protracted and devastating conflict against the Holy League. This coalition, comprising the Habsburg monarchy, Poland, Lithuania, Venice, and later Russia, was formed in response to the Ottomans' second unsuccessful siege of Vienna in 1683. That defeat, as we discussed, was a watershed moment, ending the myth of Ottoman invincibility in Europe and marking the beginning of a long, arduous struggle for survival rather than expansion. This wasn't just a single battle. It was a grueling, multi-front war that pushed the Ottoman military and treasury to their absolute limits. The Holy League, fueled by renewed Christian zeal and a determination to push back the Ottoman tide, achieved significant victories throughout the war. The Habsburgs, under brilliant commanders like Prince Eugene of Savoy, steadily recaptured vast swaths of Hungary, which had been under Ottoman control for over 150 years. The Poles pushed back in Ukraine, and Venice made gains in Dalmatia and the Aegean. The sheer length and intensity of the war, combined with the superior organization and increasingly modernized tactics of the European armies, exacted a heavy toll on the Ottomans. Their traditional military advantages had evaporated, and their logistical challenges were immense. By the late 1690s, both sides were exhausted, but the Ottomans were clearly on the losing side. Their resources were depleted, their armies were suffering from continuous defeats, and internal unrest was simmering. Recognizing the futility of continuing the war, the Ottomans, under Sultan Mustafa II, reluctantly agreed to negotiate a peace treaty. These negotiations culminated in the signing of the Treaty of Karlowitz on January 26, 1699. The terms of the Treaty of Karlowitz were nothing short of a humiliation for the once mighty Ottoman Empire. It marked the first time the Ottomans had to formally cede large, strategically important territories to European powers. Hungary, almost entirely, including Transylvania and Slavonia, was ceded to the Habsburg monarchy, effectively ending 150 years of Ottoman rule in much of the region. This was a monumental loss, both economically and strategically, and a huge boost for the rising Habsburg power. Podolia, a region in present-day Ukraine, was returned to Poland. Morea, the Peloponnese Peninsula in Greece, and significant parts of Dalmatia were ceded to Venice. Russia, while not a signatory to the initial treaty due to delays, soon after signed a separate peace, the Treaty of Constantinople, 1700, which ceded the fortress of Azov to them, granting Russia its first foothold on the Black Sea. The Treaty of Karlowitz was more than just a territorial adjustment. It represented a fundamental shift in the European balance of power. For the Ottomans, it was a profound psychological blow. For centuries, their foreign policy had been one of continuous expansion, always on the offensive, always dictating terms. Now, for the first time, they were forced to acknowledge their military inferiority and accept terms dictated by European powers. It was a clear and undeniable signal that the era of Ottoman expansion was over, and the era of Ottoman retreat had begun. The European powers, once terrified by the Ottoman juggernaut, now saw an opportunity to roll back its gains. This treaty forced the Ottomans to confront the painful reality of their military and technological backwardness. It spurred a period of introspection and a hesitant realization that reforms were desperately needed to stem the tide of further losses. However, the path to reform would be fraught with internal resistance, and often too little, too late. Historians still argue whether Karlowitz was the definitive start of Ottoman decline, or merely the most visible symptom of processes already long underway. But its symbolic significance as the moment the empire publicly acknowledged its waning power is undeniable. It was the moment the world realized the unstoppable force might just be stoppable after all. The loss of Hungary, in particular, was catastrophic. It removed a vast, rich agricultural land from Ottoman control and brought the Habsburgs right up to their borders, setting the stage for centuries of conflict along a new, redefined frontier. The treaty also emboldened other European powers to increasingly view the Ottoman Empire as the sick man of Europe, a vast but decaying entity ripe for dismemberment. This perception, while perhaps an oversimplification, would shape European foreign policy towards the Ottomans for the next 2 centuries, leading to constant diplomatic pressure and further territorial losses. The once dominant empire, which had commanded fear and awe, was now inspiring a mix of pity and predatory ambition. The humiliating terms of the Treaty of Karlowitz and the stark realization of their military and technological inferiority finally jolted the Ottoman leadership into a hesitant, often sporadic, but ultimately persistent effort towards reforms and modernization. However, this was no easy task. These attempts were constantly met with fierce internal resistance from entrenched interests and external pressures from predatory European powers. It was like trying to turn a colossal, ancient cruise liner around in a stormy sea, with half the crew actively sabotaging the engine and rival ships taking potshots. The initial reform efforts in the 18th century were largely focused on the military, attempting to address the obvious gap that had emerged with European armies. Sultans like Selim III, reigned 1789–1807, were acutely aware of the need to create a new, Western-style army, equipped with modern artillery and trained in contemporary tactics. Selim III famously established the Nizam-ul-Jadid, New Order, army, recruiting and training new units according to European models, often with the help of European military advisors. He also reformed the navy and established new military schools to teach modern sciences and engineering. This was a direct, albeit belated, attempt to catch up with the military revolution that had swept through Europe. However, these reforms were met with furious opposition from the very institutions they sought to replace, particularly the Janissaries. The Janissaries, now a powerful and conservative guild rather than an elite fighting force, viewed the Nizam-ul-Jadid as a direct threat to their privileges, their income, and their traditional role. They fomented revolts, assassinated reformist officials, and eventually, in 1807, launched a massive uprising that deposed and imprisoned Selim III, ultimately leading to his murder. This violent resistance tragically highlighted the deep structural obstacles to reform within the empire. It was a classic case of the old guard refusing to cede power, even if it meant the eventual demise of the very system they claimed to protect. Historians still argue whether the Janissaries' resistance was purely self-interest or a genuine cultural objection to westernization. But their destructive impact on reform efforts is undeniable. The early 19th century saw another powerful, reform-minded sultan in Mahmud II, reigned 1808–1839. Learning from Selim III's tragic fate, Mahmud II was far more cunning and ruthless in his approach. He understood that to implement meaningful reforms, he first had to neutralize the Janissary threat. In 1826, he orchestrated the infamous Auspicious Incident, a calculated move where he provoked a Janissary revolt, and then, with the support of loyal troops and the public, unleashed his modernized artillery on their barracks, massacring thousands and effectively annihilating the core. This brutal act, while horrific, removed the single greatest institutional obstacle to reform, and finally allowed Mahmud to pursue his modernization agenda without fear of immediate overthrow. It was a clear, unambiguous statement: my way or the highway. And the highway here involves cannons. With the Janissaries gone, Mahmud II embarked on a comprehensive program of modernization that touched almost every aspect of Ottoman society. He abolished the timar system, replacing it with a more centralized tax collection system. He reformed the divan, replacing traditional offices with Western-style ministries. He introduced European-style uniforms, established a modern army based on conscription, and sent students to Europe for education. He also took steps to centralize power further, bringing provincial governors more directly under imperial control. These were not cosmetic changes. They were fundamental attempts to reshape the Ottoman state into a more modern, centralized, and efficient entity. However, these internal reform efforts were always complicated by relentless external pressures. The 19th century was the era of intense European imperialism, and the sick man of Europe became a prime target for the territorial ambitions of Russia, Austria-Hungary, Britain, and France. Russia consistently pushed for control over Ottoman territories in the Balkans and the Black Sea, often using the pretext of protecting Orthodox Christians within the empire. This led to numerous devastating wars, such as the Crimean War, 1853-1856, where Britain and France intervened to prevent Russia from gaining too much power, illustrating the complex web of European rivalries playing out on Ottoman soil. The Balkans became a hotbed of nationalist uprisings, supported and often instigated by European powers. Greeks, Serbs, Bulgarians, and Romanians all fought for independence, leading to further territorial losses and draining Ottoman resources in prolonged conflicts. The European powers often intervened, sometimes to protect Christian minorities, sometimes to carve out spheres of influence, and sometimes, frankly, just to grab land. Egypt, under Muhammad Ali, gradually broke away from effective Ottoman control, though nominally remaining part of the empire. This loss of direct control over one of the empire's wealthiest provinces was a severe economic and strategic blow. So, while reform efforts gathered pace, the empire was constantly fighting a multi-front battle against its own internal conservatism and against relentless European encroachment. Every step towards modernization was met with fierce resistance, and every external war drained the resources needed for those very reforms. It was a desperate race against time, with the empire trying to rebuild itself even as powerful neighbors were chipping away at its edges, creating a truly precarious and challenging existence. The future of the Ottoman Empire, once seemingly limitless, was now very much in doubt, constantly battling forces from within and without, building on the foundation, or rather, the rubble, left by Mahmud II's forceful reforms. The mid-19th century Ottoman Empire entered an intense, ambitious, and ultimately fraught period known as the Tanzimat era. This period, roughly spanning from 1839 to 1876, was a concerted, top-down attempt to systematically modernize and centralize the empire along Western European lines, moving beyond mere military reform to encompass legal, administrative, educational, and social spheres. It was an ambitious undertaking, akin to trying to completely rewire a vast, ancient mansion while people are still living in it. And sometimes, those people really don't like the new wiring. The Tanzimat, meaning reorganization, was driven by a generation of reform-minded statesmen, largely educated in Europe or influenced by Western ideas, who genuinely believed that the empire's survival depended on its ability to catch up with the rapidly advancing European powers. They understood that military weakness was intertwined with administrative inefficiency, economic stagnation, and a legal system that often seemed antiquated in a rapidly globalizing world. The goal was not just to patch things up, but to fundamentally transform the Ottoman state into a modern, bureaucratic, and more equitable entity, capable of competing on the world stage. At its core, the Tanzimat aimed to create a more centralized and efficient state administration. This involved establishing new ministries based on European models, streamlining bureaucracy, and sending provincial governors from Istanbul to assert tighter control over distant regions. The old system of various decentralized authorities was slowly, sometimes painfully, replaced by a more direct chain of command from the sultan's capital. This was an attempt to reduce corruption and increase tax revenues, which were desperately needed to fund the growing military and infrastructure projects. It was like switching from a complicated, ancient ledger system to a brand new, if sometimes glitchy, computer program. Legal reforms were a significant aspect of the Tanzimat. The reformers sought to create a more uniform system of justice, moving away from the patchwork of religious and local laws. New secular courts were established alongside the existing Islamic courts, and new commercial and criminal codes, largely based on French models, were introduced. These reforms aimed to protect the rights of all subjects, regardless of their religion, and to provide a more predictable legal environment for foreign investors and merchants. The Hatu Sharif of Gulhane, 1839, and the Hatu Humayun, 1856, were landmark imperial edicts that guaranteed security of life and property for all subjects, abolished tax farming, and formally extended equality before the law to non-Muslims. This was revolutionary. For the time, though, as always, implementing such sweeping changes across a vast, diverse empire proved challenging. Education also received significant attention. New secular schools were established, from primary schools to military academies and medical colleges, aiming to train a new generation of bureaucrats, officers, and professionals loyal to the state and educated in modern sciences and languages. These schools were designed to compete with the traditional madrasas and to provide the skilled workforce needed for a modern state. There was even a push to educate women, albeit within certain traditional confines, recognizing the broader societal need for progress. Economically, the Tanzimat aimed to integrate the Ottoman Empire more fully into the global capitalist system. Efforts were made to improve infrastructure, including the construction of railways and telegraph lines, to facilitate trade and communication. New financial institutions were established, including the Imperial Ottoman Bank, to manage state finances and attract foreign investment. The hope was that by modernizing the economy, the empire could generate the wealth needed to fund its military and administrative reforms, breaking out of its cycle of debt and decline. However, despite the earnest intentions and often significant achievements, the Tanzimat faced enormous hurdles. Firstly, the reforms were expensive, requiring massive foreign loans that eventually plunged the empire into crippling debt, leading to foreign control over its finances. Secondly, the changes were often resisted by conservative elements within the bureaucracy, the religious establishment, and segments of the population who viewed them as an abandonment of Islamic traditions and an unwelcome imposition of Western values. It was like trying to force everyone to eat kale when they really just wanted baklava. Furthermore, the very concept of Ottomanism, a shared Ottoman identity that transcended religious and ethnic lines, which the Tanzimat promoted to foster unity, largely failed. Instead, the period inadvertently fueled nationalist movements among the empire's diverse populations in the Balkans and among Arabs. By granting equal rights, it paradoxically empowered these groups to demand even greater autonomy or outright independence, seeing themselves as distinct nations rather than loyal Ottoman subjects. The increasing intervention of European powers, often posing as protectors of their respective Christian or national groups within the empire, further exacerbated these centrifugal forces. By the late 1870s, the Tanzimat era effectively ended with a brief experiment in constitutional monarchy under Sultan Abdulhamid II, quickly followed by his authoritarian backlash. While it didn't halt the empire's decline, the Tanzimat left a lasting legacy. It laid the groundwork for many of the institutions and legal frameworks that would later form the basis of the modern Turkish Republic and influenced the development of many Middle Eastern states. Historians still argue whether the Tanzimat was a genuine attempt at salvation or merely a desperate delaying tactic, but its impact on Ottoman and indeed modern regional history is undeniably profound. It showed a desperate yet determined effort to survive in a rapidly changing world, even if the odds were increasingly stacked against them. Despite the ambitious, albeit flawed, efforts of the Tanzimat reforms to revitalize the ailing empire, the Ottoman state found itself sailing into the turbulent waters of the 20th century, facing insurmountable challenges. The late 19th and early 20th centuries saw a rapid acceleration of internal decay and relentless external pressures, culminating in the Young Turk Revolution and the final agonizing collapse of the empire during and after World War I. It was the last desperate act of a once grand play, where the stage was crumbling and the audience was already leaving. The end of the Tanzimat era ushered in the autocratic rule of Sultan Abdul Hamid II, reigned 1876–1909, who, after a brief and ill-fated experiment with a constitution, suspended parliament and ruled as an absolute monarch. While Abdul Hamid genuinely attempted to strengthen the empire, investing in infrastructure like railways and telegraphs, and trying to foster a pan-Islamic identity to counter rising nationalism, his repressive measures and heavy reliance on secret police alienated many reform-minded intellectuals and military officers. He was trying to modernize, but he wanted to do it on his own terms, without any pesky democratic accountability, which, as history often shows, usually doesn't end well for the autocrat. It was this growing discontent among a Western-educated elite, particularly within the military, that fueled the Young Turk Revolution of 1908. This was not a bloody popular uprising, but a coup d'etat orchestrated by the Committee of Union and Progress, COPI, a secret society formed by disaffected officers and intellectuals. They forced Abdul Hamid II to restore the constitution and parliament, marking the effective end of the Sultan's absolute rule and a brief return to constitutionalism. The Young Turks initially promised reform, liberty, and a more inclusive Ottomanism, but their own rule quickly devolved into an increasingly authoritarian and nationalist regime, dominated by figures like Enver Pasha, Talat Pasha, and Kemal Pasha. It was a case of meet the new boss, same as the old boss, just with a snazzier uniform and even grander ideas of power. Under Young Turk rule, the empire continued to bleed territory. The Italo-Turkish War, 1911–1912, saw Italy seize Libya, the last major Ottoman possession in North Africa. This was followed almost immediately by the catastrophic Balkan Wars, 1912–1913, where a coalition of Balkan states, Bulgaria, Serbia, Greece, and Montenegro, decisively defeated the Ottomans, stripping the empire of nearly all its remaining European territories, including Adrianople, Edirne, a former Ottoman capital. These wars were devastating, both militarily and psychologically, shrinking the empire almost entirely to its Anatolian core and some Arab provinces. It was like watching a giant pie getting smaller and smaller, with everyone taking a slice. These territorial losses, combined with a growing sense of vulnerability and a desire to regain lost prestige, pushed the Young Turk government into a fateful decision. Aligning with the Central Powers, Germany and Austria-Hungary, at the outbreak of World War I in 1914. This was a desperate gamble, a last-ditch attempt to either regain lost ground or, at the very least, secure the empire's survival against its long-standing enemies, particularly Russia and Britain. It was like placing all your chips on a single, very risky bet at the casino, hoping for a miracle. The war proved to be the final crushing blow. The Ottoman Empire, fighting on multiple fronts, suffered immense casualties and widespread devastation. The Gallipoli campaign, 1915-1916, saw the Ottomans, despite heavy losses, successfully repel an Allied invasion aimed at capturing Istanbul. A significant military victory, but one that came at a horrendous cost in lives. In the Middle East, the Arab Revolt, supported by the British, famously involving T. E. Lawrence, undermined Ottoman control over its Arab provinces. Campaigns in Mesopotamia, Iraq, and the Levant saw the British steadily advance, capturing Baghdad, Jerusalem, and Damascus. The Armenian Genocide, a horrific and systematic extermination of the Armenian population by the Ottoman government, occurred during this period, leaving an indelible stain on the empire's final years and remains a deeply contested and painful historical fact, the echoes of which still resonate today. Historians still argue intensely over the precise legal classification of these events, but the tragic human toll is undeniable. By late 1918, exhausted and defeated, the Ottoman Empire signed the Armistice of Mudros, effectively ending its participation in the war. The terms of the armistice were severe, allowing the Allied powers to occupy key strategic points and effectively dismember the empire. The subsequent Treaty of Sèvres, 1920, though never fully ratified, proposed carving up much of Anatolia and the Arab lands into zones of influence and independent states, leaving only a rump Turkish state. It was a complete humiliation, a final, brutal dismantling of centuries of empire. However, from the ashes of the empire, a new nationalist movement emerged in Anatolia, led by the charismatic military officer Mustafa Kemal Atatürk. He rallied Turkish resistance against the Allied occupation and the Treaty of Sèvres, fighting the Turkish War of Independence, 1919-1922. His victories forced the Allies to renegotiate, leading to the Treaty of Lausanne in 1923, which recognized the borders of the modern Turkish Republic. On November 1st, 1922, the Ottoman Sultanate was officially abolished, ending 623 years of continuous Ottoman rule. The Caliphate, the spiritual authority of the Ottoman sultans, was abolished in 1924, and Mustafa Kemal Atatürk embarked on a radical program of secularization and westernization, transforming what remained of the Ottoman heartland into the modern secular Republic of Turkey. The once vast, multi-ethnic, and multi-religious Ottoman Empire was no more, replaced by a nation-state born from its ruins. The long, winding journey of the Ottoman Empire, from a small Anatolian beylik to a global superpower and back down to its eventual dissolution, was finally complete. The sun dips below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of deep orange and fading violet, as our journey through the rise and fall of the Ottoman Empire draws to a close. Take a deep breath, letting the day's last light gently kiss your eyelids. Imagine those ancient domes and minarets, once vibrant centers of a bustling, powerful realm, now standing quiet under the same soft twilight. The grand sieges, the whispered intrigues, the clash of civilizations, all settle now into the quiet currents of history, leaving behind only the profound echo of a civilization that shaped so much of our world. It's a reminder that even the mightiest empires, like the grandest stories, eventually find their ending, their chapters closing with a gentle, fading whisper. Let the quiet hum of these ancient tales lull you into a peaceful slumber, knowing that the past, however epic, always finds its tranquil resting place